Good morning to all of you. Any doubts from the previous class? Let me just take a couple of minutes. There are some new students, probably I didn't see you in the last class. You are not there in the last class. Okay, you did it online. Okay. Hmm. Government is responsible to Rajya Sabha is absolutely wrong. They can give that the government is accountable to the parliament or responsible to the parliament, that is inclusive of Lok Sabha. So therefore, it may be right depending upon the statement. But if it is saying that the government is accountable to the Rajya Sabha, there is no such thing. That is not the right thing. The government is either accountable and responsible to the parliament or to the Lok Sabha in specific. So these two things can be right. Again, it depends upon in which context they are asking this particular statement. Because if you look into the constitution specifically says that the government is accountable, the Council of Ministers are accountable to the Lok Sabha. Okay. But again, sometimes depending upon the question, they can put the word parliament also. That by experience you will get it, in which context it has been asked. Okay. Okay, so just let me take a couple of minutes as to what we have seen till this point of time. It is not formally added, but that is what the constitution is. Now, say for example, in certain cases, the Supreme Court has interpreted certain provisions. And whatever the interpretation that is given by the Supreme Court is not going to make any changes in the constitution. But still what the constitution is, the interpretation that is given by the Supreme Court. What will be formally added to the constitution is whatever amendment that has been carried out by the parliament. So that will be formally inserted into the constitution, but not the interpretation that is given by the Supreme Court. But the meaning of the constitution would stand as it is interpreted by the Supreme Court. Yes, they are part of a constitutional law because that is a constitution. Now, say for example, whenever there is an ambiguity, the Supreme Court gives some clarification. So, in the future, whenever something has to be done with regard to those provisions, it has to be done as per the interpretation that is given by the Supreme Court. It cannot be done otherwise as it is given in the constitution. So, therefore, they will also be part of what is called as the constitutional law. Alright. Okay, so let me just take a couple of minutes. So, what we have seen in the last class? First, we have tried to understand, first we have seen about the syllabus. We have tried to understand from where the questions can be asked. Then we try to understand as to what is constitution. So, you might have a fair idea as to what is a constitution. To put it in a very simple way, it is the rule book. But how constitution differs from the other rules is the constitution is the fundamental rule book of the country. And then we try to understand, after understanding that, what is the difference between a written and an unwritten constitution. Though the Indian constitution is a written constitution, there are certain countries which also has unwritten constitution. So, what is the fundamental difference between a written constitution and an unwritten constitution? In a written constitution, there exists a difference between what is a constitutional law and an ordinary law. That difference does not exist when it comes to an unwritten constitution. So, the name unwritten means, that means there is nothing which is specifically written as a constitution. So, every rule that they make is part of their constitution. Therefore, it is an unwritten constitution. It does not mean that they are not codified. It only means nothing specifically codified as the constitution. Every law that is enacted becomes part of their constitution. Then we went on to understand some of the salient features of the constitution, and we have also understood the concept of constitutionalism. And then we have also understood the political science definition of state. And then we have also understood some of the salient features. The first thing that you have understood is democracy. And in democracy, we have understood that in case of India, it is a indirect democracy or a representative democracy. And then we also try to understand the concept of parliamentary democracy. Can anyone tell me what is the very essence of parliamentary democracy? That the executives are accountable to the legislature. So that's a very essence of parliamentary democracy. And we have seen that so we also understood as to what is the parliamentary democracy and what is the very essence of parliamentary democracy. What is the very essence of parliamentary democracy? The executives are accountable to the legislature. So that's the very essence. That means at any point of time there needs to have what is called as a majority, and this can be verified by what is called as a no confidence motion. When a no confidence motion is introduced, then through that no confidence motion, if the government does not survive, then the government will be defeated. So at any point of time they need to have a majority. And then we also understood the next concept is, these are the two things that you have seen. Okay, so now we will try to understand the next concept, that is what is called as separation of powers. Okay, there is one question from one of the students, sir, why the idea of constitutionalism negative in orientation? The answer lies in whatever we already seen. Why do you think that the idea of constitutionalism has negative orientation? Because it limits the powers of the government. So whenever you limit the powers of the government, it has a negative orientation. It is not negative for the citizens, but it is negative for the powers of the state. It is negative for the government. So that is why it has got negative orientation. Because as we already seen, the important aspect of constitutionalism is it is going to limit the powers of the state. Is that clear? Okay. How do the constitution evolves through? See, the constitution does not evolve through conventions, but in certain countries, say for example, especially when it is an unwritten constitution, the convention has no place in a written constitution, because in a written constitution, whatever is there in the written in the constitution is what the constitution. But when you talk of some of the constitution which is unwritten, say for example in United Kingdom, what is also part of their constitution is a long-standing conventional practices that they have been following over a period of time. So the conventions do have a role to play in an unwritten constitution, but not in a written constitution. Conventional practices means that they have been following it for a long period of time. So traditionally they are following it, so they are also accepted as the constitutional practices. But it does not have any role in what is called as a written constitution. All right. Although we also follow some conventional practices, but those conventional practices are not equivalent to that of the constitution, which means that can be changed. But in an unwritten constitution, conventional practices is also part of their constitution. Okay. Okay, so please come to the next thing, that is what is called as separation of powers. Okay, write down the next topic, that is separation of powers. Separation of powers. Now, what do you understand by separation of powers? So, separation of powers means horizontal distribution of powers. So, the key word that you have to remember is horizontal distribution of powers. That is a basic thing. The power is distributed horizontally between different organs of the state. Now, based on the discussion that you have had yesterday, can anyone tell me what are the three important organs of the state? Legislature, the executive and the judiciary. So, these are the three important organs. You have got what is called as the legislature, the executive, and then you have what is called as the judiciary. These are the three important organs. You have got the legislature, you have got the executive, and then you have got what is called as the judiciary, and they are horizontally placed. The philosophical basis of the concept of separation of powers is basically the power should not be concentrated in one single authority. Now, what would be the disadvantage if the power is concentrated in one single authority? All the powers are given in one single authority. Is there a possibility that the power can be abused? Is there a possibility that they can be arbitrarily exercised? So, therefore, the members of the Constituent Assembly want that we will not give all the powers to run a particular state, to run a particular country. Number of things has to be done. But let us not give all the powers and authorities in the hands of one particular organ, but rather we will distribute this power to the different organs. And that is basically what is called as idea of separation of powers. So, with the concept of separation of powers, the Constituent Assembly, when they are drafting the Constitution of India, they created three organs under the Constitution, most important organs. One is of course the legislature, and then the executive, and then the judiciary. And they also entrusted some powers as to what they are supposed to do. And what they are supposed to do primarily, I am not talking all the functions. So primarily, one of the important function of the legislature is law making. So when I say legislature, what does it mean by legislature? What amounts to the legislature, or what are the organs that is part of the legislature? The parliament and the state legislature. And what is primarily they are responsible, supposed to do is law making. And then you have got another organ, what is called as executive. What the executive is supposed to do? Primarily their role is to implement the laws that is made by the legislature. So that is law implementation. The second thing is law implementation. So you have got law making, you have law implementation, and then the last thing is what is called as judiciary. What is the role of the judiciary? The role of judiciary is, what is the role of the judiciary? The role of the judiciary is to judicially review the actions that is done by the legislature and the executives. Now what is done by the legislature? They make laws. What is done by the executive? They implement the laws. But try to understand that whatever the law that is made by the legislature and how the law is implemented by the executive, both has to be in line with what? Both has to be strictly in line with the constitution. The law cannot be made by the legislature in such a way that it goes against the constitution. The law cannot be implemented by the judiciary that it goes against the constitution. So for example, the constitution gives us certain fundamental rights. And let us take one fundamental right, which talks about what is called as right to freedom of speech and expression. While the constitution guarantees the right to freedom of speech and expression to everyone, can any law be made by the parliament that would take away the right to freedom of speech and expression? No, not possible. Can the laws be implemented by the executives in such a way that it takes away the right to freedom of speech and expression? Not possible. Suppose in case this is done by either the legislature or by the executive, who can strike down, who can review those things? It is a judiciary. So what is the role of the judiciary? The role of the judiciary is primarily to judicially review. Judicial review the actions of whom? The actions of both the legislature and the executive, so that they are not in violation of what is called as the provisions in the constitution. So who is ultimately to protect the constitution of India? It is the role of the judiciary. The role of the legislature is primarily to make laws. The role of the executives is primarily to implement those laws. And the role of the judiciary is primarily to see whether the actions of the executive and the actions of the legislature, is it in violation of the constitution. And if it is in violation of the constitution, what can be done by the judiciary? The judiciary can strike them down, and that is basically what is called as judicial review. So this is primarily the role of judiciary. Now try to understand, that means the very idea of separation of powers is that there would be different organs in the state, and these different organs would be entrusted with different set of responsibilities, and that's basically what is called as separation of powers. And thereby, by providing the separation of powers, they also prevent the arbitrary exercise of power by any particular authority. But however, the most important thing is, do you think that in the Indian constitution there is strict separation of powers? Is there a strict separation of powers under the constitution of India? How many of you think that there is a strict separation of powers? When I say strict separation of powers, that means there is no overlap between these organs. They are completely separate from one another. Is that the case? Is there a strict separation of powers, or is there any overlap between these organs? Is there an overlap? So where there is an overlap? How many of you think that there is an overlap? Is there an overlap? Of course, there is an overlap. There is no strict separation of powers. The Indian constitution is not based on the concept of strict separation of powers. There is certain element of overlap, especially between whom? Especially between the legislature and the executives. Because in our country, the executives are not separate from the legislature. Because in the previous class itself, when I explained the parliamentary democracy, we have clearly understood from where the government is formed. From the parliament. It is the members of the parliament, they also become ministers. Say for example, Mr. Narendra Modi, who is the Prime Minister of India, is he a member of parliament? Mr. Amit Shah, who is a member of parliament, he is also a minister. So he is also a member of parliament. So therefore, there is some element of overlap between whom? There is an overlap between the legislature as well as the executive. But however, if you see in certain countries, which is also a democracy, there is strict separation of powers. That means there is no overlap between the legislature and the executive. So for example, in United States of America, the executive is different, the legislature is different, the judiciary is separate. So there is a strict separation of powers. They also follow the principle of separation of powers, but they have a strict separation of powers. But because India is a parliamentary democracy, in a parliamentary democracy, there is some element of overlap between whom? There is some element of overlap between the legislature and the executive. I hope you understand where there is an overlap. You all understood? But so therefore, to make sure that this principle of separation of powers work well, the Constitution of India relies upon more on what is called as a principle of checks and balances rather than the principle of what is called as separation of powers. So please take down a question. So such questions can be asked in the mains examination, and then I'll explain it subsequently. Though the Constitution of India provides for separation of powers, though the Constitution of India provides for separation of powers, though the Constitution of India provides for separation of powers, it is not strictly okay. So just make a small correction. Though the Constitution of India provides for separation of powers, okay, just strike it down. Just strike it down. Change this particular statement. The Constitution of India provides for checks and balances. The Constitution of India provides for checks and balances rather than strict separation of powers. The Constitution of India provides for a system of, just add one more line, the Constitution of India provides for a system of checks and balances, rather than strict separation of powers. Elaborate 10 marks. So normally when the question is for 10 marks, you can write up to 200 to 250 words. But although I would suggest right now, don't worry about the word limit. So right now just focus on answer writing. But over a period of time, if you start writing answers seriously, it will take 6 months for you to adhere to this particular rule. That when I say that you keep writing answers seriously means that on a weekly basis you write at least minimum 3 to 4 questions, if not on a daily basis. When you do this for 3 to 6 months, then probably you will get the habit of following that word limit. But right now initially you will not be able to do that. It may be more, it may be less, don't worry about it, but start writing the answers. Okay, just look into this particular question, what the question is saying. Can anyone read the question?
The Constitution of India provides for a system of checks and balances rather than strict separation of powers.
Okay, so do you understand the question? The Constitution of India provides for system of checks and balances rather than strict separation of powers. That means the question is saying, though there is separation of powers, but what is more emphasized under the Constitution of India is not strict separation of powers, but it is more of what is called as checks and balances. So first let me explain, and then I'll tell you as to how you can structure the answer also. So we have understood the concept of separation of powers. You also understood as to why there is no strict separation of powers, because in a parliamentary democracy there is some element of overlap between the legislature and the executive, so they are not completely separate from one another. But however, what has been emphasized by the members of the Constituent Assembly is what is called a system of checks and balances. Checks and balances means how one organ has some element of control over the other organ. That is what is checks and balances. So now let us try to understand how one organ in the state is having some element of control over the other organ. So what is the element of control one organ is having over the other organ? Say for example, judiciary, one organ. Is it having some element of control over the other organ? Yes, they have the power of judicial review. And through the power of judicial review, they can strike down the laws that is made by the legislature. Sorry, they can strike down the laws that is made by the legislature. They can also strike down the actions of the executive. So this is some element of control that the judiciary is having over the legislature and the executive. Now, does the legislature has got any control over the executive? The legislature has got control over the executive because the executive always need to have majority in the legislature. If at any point of time the executives have no majority in the legislature, then the government will be removed. So therefore, the legislature can have control over the executive. And similarly, does the legislature have any amount of control over the judiciary? The legislature also has some element of control over the judiciary because the legislature, through a motion, that they can remove the judges. Although the judges cannot be completely removed by the legislature, but the judges in the Supreme Court and High Court, they can be removed. Do you know that they can be removed? And they can be removed by whom? Who can remove them? Is it the Parliament or is it the President of India? So if you have an understanding that the Parliament can remove the judges of the Supreme Court and High Court, that is wrong. So who can remove them? It is only the President of India, because it is the President of India who is the appointing authority for the judges of the Supreme Court and High Court. So who is the removal authority? It is the President. But the President cannot do so unless and until a motion is passed in the Parliament. So this power can be exercised by the President when? Only when the majority members in the Parliament agree to that. And when the majority members in the Parliament agree to the removal of the judges, then a formal order can be issued by the President of India. So the President of India cannot do that unless and until it is accepted by the majority members in the legislature. So therefore, the legislature has some element of control over the judiciary, and similarly the executives have some element of control over the judiciary, because ultimately who has to remove them? The President. But the President cannot do so unless and until it is approved by the majority members in the Parliament. So in this way, do you think that there is some element of control over one organ by the other organ? So the legislature, judiciary is having control over the actions of executive and legislature. The legislature is having control over the executives because they have to maintain the majority. And similarly, if the judges are functioning arbitrary, they can be removed. And who is authority to remove the judges? The President. But the President can do so only after the majority members in the Parliament agree to that. So in this way, they also have control over the judiciary. So this is what is called as a system of checks and balances. Checks and balances. So checks and balances means to what extent one authority is having control over the other organ. Is that clear to all of you? So you'll have to understand as to what is the system of separation of powers, and why under the Constitution of India there is no strict separation of powers. And at the same time, you should also understand, though we do not have strict separation of powers, we rely upon the principle of what is called as checks and balances. So when you write this particular answer, first you should be able to explain. So these are all the things that has to be there. First you should be able to explain what is system of separation of powers, and why under the Constitution of India there is no strict separation of powers, because there is an overlap between the legislature and the executive because of the parliamentary democracy. So first you will explain your idea of separation of powers, then you will explain your idea of what is called as why there is no strict separation of powers, and then you will explain the concept of what is called as checks and balances, and then you will also give examples as to how one organ is having control over the other organ. So that is all the three things has to be part of your answer. Yes. So the Article 50 of the Constitution has categorically said there has to be separation of judiciary and the executive. So after independence, these things has been completely segregated. Although in certain states, because some magisterial powers are given to the district magistrate, but most of the power with regard to the criminal cases has been stripped away from the magistrate. It is completely under the judiciary. Okay. All right. So this is the concept of separation of powers and the system of checks and balances. Is that clear to all of you? Is that clear to all of you? Okay. The executive has no control over the legislature. That is how the parliamentary democracy works. In a parliamentary democracy, the essence is what? It is only the executive should be accountable to the legislature, not vice versa. And ultimately, the legislature is accountable to the people of this particular country, and none of the other thing. Apart from the judiciary can review their actions. So it is not that the legislature will be accountable to the executive, but rather the executive should be accountable to the legislature in a parliamentary democracy. Okay. But yes, the legislature is also not something which is not accountable. The legislature is accountable to whom? to the people and also to the judiciary. The judiciary can review them, okay, review the actions of the legislature. Alright, so please come to the next topic, that is division of powers. Is it clear to all of you what is separation of powers and also system of checks and balances? If you want to write the answer, you can write the answer and show it to me tomorrow, day after tomorrow, whenever you are writing, you can show it to me after the class. Okay, so please come to the next topic, that is division of powers. How many of you heard about the concept of division of powers? The simple difference that you'll have to understand between separation of powers and the division of powers is, while the separation of powers provides for what is called as horizontal distribution of powers, where the division of powers provides for vertical division of powers or vertical distribution of powers. Okay, let me just try to explain that further. Or in other words, wherever there is division of powers, it is largely what is called as a federal political system. Have you ever heard of the concept federal political system? How many of you heard about the federal political system? How many of you heard that India is a federal political system? Okay, so India is a federal political system, which means that there is what is called as division of powers. Which means that there is what is called as division of powers. So this is basically the understanding you should have. So let us try to understand that further. What is this division of powers? So separation of powers, I said that it is the powers are distributed horizontally, but now we are trying to understand what is called as division of powers. What are the three organs in the state? The legislature, and then you have got the executive, and then you have got what is called as judiciary. So now let us try to understand how the division of powers functions. Now division of powers means vertical distribution of powers. So if you see vertically, legislature are at two levels. One is what is called as union legislature. So there are two legislatures in our country. One is a union legislature, and then you have the state legislature. Union legislature and the state legislature. So union legislature is nothing but what? It is the parliament. And state legislature is the state legislature. Now union legislature comprise of what are the constituent parts of the union legislature? Lok Sabha, Rajya Sabha and the President of India. And what constitute the state legislature? The state legislature constitute of the legislative assembly, and in case if they want to have legislative council, that will also be part of it, and then the governor of that particular state. So they constitute what is called as the state legislature. But try to keep this in your mind, which we will study in detail elaborately at the later stages, that in case of the parliament, both the houses are mandatory, that is Lok Sabha as well as Rajya Sabha. But in case of the state legislature, the legislative council is not mandatory. If a state want to have legislative council, they can have it. Otherwise, it is not mandatory for them to have it. If a state is having the council, then the council is also part of the state legislature. But if they don't want to have the council, there will not be any council. So therefore, in case of the state legislature, not necessarily in all the states they have a legislative council. Only very few states in our country has got the legislative council today. Does anyone know how many states in India has got legislative council today? How many states has got that? As of now, there are 6 states in our country has got the legislative council. Anyways, that's a factual information that we'll deal with later. Okay, now the point here is, this is in case of the legislature, and similarly if you see executives can be at 2 levels. What are the executives at 2 levels? One is the union executive, and then you have what is called as state executive, and you have got what is called as state executive. So we have legislature, union legislature, state legislature, executive, union executive and the state executive. Now the most important thing that you have to understand is, okay, who constitutes the union executive? The Union Executive, who is the head of the Union Executive? The President, not the Prime Minister. The head of the Union Executive is the President of India. Although he is a nominal executive, but if a question comes who is the head of the Union Executive, it is the President. It includes the President, it includes the Prime Minister and the Council of Ministers. These are the majorly the executives. And then here, who is the head of the State Executive? The Governor, the Chief Minister and the Council of Ministers. So this is how the Constitution provides for, but the point that you have to understand with regard to the division of powers is, now try to understand the division of powers. Although there are three important organs in the state, the powers that is distributed between the three organs, horizontal distribution is what is called as separation of powers. But on the other hand, if you talk of the legislature per se, the legislature is further divided into what is called as union legislature and state legislature. The union legislature is at the top, and below the union legislature you have what is called as a state legislature. Although I have given it parallelly, but the union legislature at the top, and below that you have what is called as state legislature. And the division of powers means what is or to what extent the power is distributed between the union and the state legislature, and that's basically what is called as division of powers. And who is giving the power to the union legislature as well as the state legislature? From where do they derive the power? From the Constitution of India. It is the Constitution of India. It is the Constitution of India that gives a power to what is called as the union legislature also. It is a Constitution of India that gives the power to the state legislature also. That means basically there is some element of division between the powers of the union legislature and the powers of the state legislature. It is a Constitution of India that says to what extent the parliament can make laws and to what extent the state legislature can make laws. So it is basically given in the Constitution itself. That means the state legislature is not at the mercy of the union legislature. The state legislature is directly deriving the powers from where? From the Constitution of India. That power is divided in the Constitution itself. That's basically what is called as division of powers. Is that clear? And similarly, if you see what is the power of the union executive and what is the power of the state executive, who is giving this distribution? That is also in the Constitution. So therefore, the state executives are not at the mercy of the union executive. They are directly deriving the powers from where? From the Constitution of India. So this division is there in the Constitution itself, and that is why it is called as division of powers. So now try to understand, when it comes to the legislature, who is giving the power to the union legislature? Constitution. Who is giving the power to the state legislature? Constitution. Is the state legislature subordinate to the union legislature? Are they subordinate to the union legislature? When I say subordinate, are they in any way considered to be inferior to the union legislature? Or the state legislature, in other words, are they at the mercy of the union legislature? They are not at the mercy of the union legislature, because they directly derive the powers from where? They directly derive the powers from the Constitution. So is the union legislature. They also directly derive the power from the Constitution of India. So therefore, they cannot be considered to be subordinate. But later we will understand that although there is a division of powers, more powers has been given to the parliament than to the state legislature. But that does not make the state legislature subordinate to the what is called as a union legislature, because they both directly derive the powers from the Constitution of India. Similarly, you got what is called as the executives. In case of executives also, the union executives, from where they derive the power? From the Constitution. The state executives, they also derive the power from the Constitution of India. So this division is given in the Constitution of India itself, and that is why it is called as what? That is why they are called as division of powers. That is, the power is distributed between the different organs in a vertical manner. This is basically what is called as division of powers. Now, while there is a division of powers between the union legislature and the state legislature, the union executive and the state executive, what about the judiciary? In judiciary, is there a division of powers? How many of you think that the judiciary there is a division of powers? That means you will have to understand that the state legislature is not subordinate to the union legislature, and similarly the state executive is not subordinate to the union executive. They function independently and they derive the powers directly from the Constitution of India. What is the case with regard to the judiciary in our country? Is there a division of powers between the Supreme Court, the High Court and the subordinate courts? In case of judiciary, we have got what is called as an integrated judiciary, or in other words, we have got what is called as a hierarchy of judiciary. there is no separate judiciary for the states, there is no separate judiciary for the center. We have just only one hierarchy of judiciary. But do we have a separate legislature for the states? Do we have a separate legislature for the union? We have a separate executive for the union. We have a separate executive for the states. But that is not the case with what is called as judiciary. So judiciary is little independent. They not fall under the concept of division of powers. So when you talk of division of powers, it is only for the legislature and the executive. But when it comes to the judiciary, there is an integrated judiciary, and who is at the apex of the judiciary? The Supreme Court. And below the Supreme Court, high courts, and below the high courts, you have the subordinate courts. So here there is no separation of powers. So here there is no division of powers. Here there is an integrated judiciary. So there is one more topic where I will explain what is the concept of integrated and independent judiciary. But for time being, you try to understand as to what is division of powers. So division of powers is only with regard to the two organs of the state. What are the two organs? The legislature and the executive. And division of powers means basically the union legislature and the state legislature, they directly derive the powers from where? From the constitution, and they have what? Separate powers, and they have certain limitations as to what they can do. And similarly, there is a separate division of powers between the union executive as well as the state executive, from where they directly derive the powers. They directly derive the powers from the constitution. So therefore, you can say that the state executives are not subordinate to the union executives. The state legislature is not subordinate to the union legislature. Although, do they have equal powers is a question mark. They may not have equal powers, but definitely they are not considered to be subordinate, because they directly derive the powers from the constitution. But when it comes to judiciary, in case of judiciary, there is no separate judiciary for the state, and there is no separate judiciary for the union. There is only one single integrated judiciary in our country. And who is at the apex of this particular judiciary? It is the Supreme Court of India, which I will subsequently explain. Because in case of India, one of the important feature of our constitutional system is there is independent and integrated judiciary. Let us try to understand as to what is this independent and integrated judiciary. So before I move forward, it should be very clear to all of you as to what is the difference between separation of powers and division of powers. So what is the difference between separation of powers and division of powers? Well, separation of powers is more a horizontal distribution of powers between the different organs of the state, whereas division of powers is more vertical in nature, where there is division of powers between whom? The union legislature and the state legislature. Division of powers between the union executive and the state executive. But such division does not exist when it comes to judiciary, because in case of judiciary, we have got what is called as a single integrated judiciary. Alright. So try to understand these basic things. Now please come to the next concept, that is a federal system with unitary bias. That is again an important feature of the Indian Constitution. Now the executive also exercises checks and balances. The executive, because I told that it is an executive, it is a president who will remove the judges of the Supreme Court. Now the president is considered to be an integral part of parliament, but doesn't mean that he is part of the legislature. So there are certain things that we will understand minute nuances as we proceed. Though the president is an integral part of the parliament, the president is primarily an executive. He is not part of the legislature, although he is an integral part of the legislature. So you can ask me that why he is an executive, why he is an integral part of the legislature. The answer I will explain later when I take up the parliament. But right now you try to understand he is primarily an executive, although he is an integral part of the parliament. Okay. Yes, the president is a nominal executive or the executive head of the union, and so is the governor is the executive head of the states. In both the cases, they are all nominal executives, they are not real executives, and that's the essence of the parliamentary democracy, which we'll later understand. Okay. So we cannot understand each and everything in a very single class. We'll take it step by step. As we'll proceed, I'll explain all those things. Okay, now come to the next concept, federal system with unitary bias. What do you understand by the federal system? Federal system means it is nothing but the constitution provides for what is called as division of powers. And wherever there is division of powers, then we call that to be a federal political system. Against a federal political system, there is also something which is called as an unitary political system. Have you heard of unitary political system? What does it mean by unitary political system? Say for example, can you first give me an example of an unitary political system? United Kingdom is an example. Yes, France is an example. So, but what is a unitary political system? In a unitary political system, they do not exist what is called as division of powers. In India, it's a federal political system. There exists what is called as division of powers. And wherever, when I say that there is a division of powers, there exists some kind of division between the national and the subnational authority. What is a national authority when it comes to India? The union executive. When it comes to the executives, union executive. What is the subnational authorities? The state executives. Is there a division of powers between these two things? Wherever there is a division of power between a national authority and a subnational authority, be it the executives or be it the legislature, then we call such political system as what is called as federal political system, because there exists what is called as division of powers. But however, there are certain political system where there is no division of powers. All the powers are concentrated in only one authority, that is basically what is called as a national authority. The constitution directly gives a power to whom? To only one authority, that is a national authority. Say, take the example of United Kingdom. In United Kingdom, there is a constitution. Though it is an unwritten constitution, they have got a constitution. And the constitution gives all the executive powers upon whom? Only upon the national executive or only upon their union executive. And further, if any power is given to the subnational executives, it is given only from the national executive to the subnational executive, and it is not directly given by the constitution. Or in other words, think it like this. In case of India, when you talk of the federal political system, in case of India, when you talk of the federal political system, so this is the Indian constitution. In the Indian constitution, we say it is a federal political system because of what? That the constitution itself gives a power of to the union executive, and it is the constitution which gives a power to the state executive also. So, right, so the state executive is not at the mercy of the union executive, they are directly deriving the powers from the constitution. So, therefore, there is a division of powers as to what the union executive can do and what the state executive can do. But this is in case of, so this division of powers makes it as a federal political system, or in other words, federal political system means there is division of powers. I am just giving one example, but when you talk of the constitution of United Kingdom or the constitution of UK, if you see the constitution of UK, it is a constitution of UK that directly gives all the executive powers to the union executive or the national executive. And if at all there are state executives or subnational executives, they derive the powers from the union executive. From where they are deriving the powers? Union executive by a way of what is called as delegation. The constitution is concentrating all the powers only upon whom? Only upon the union executive. It is from the union executive they get the powers. That means which would be a better system? Is it a federal or is it a unitary political system? We are not here to make any assessment. The constitution of any country depends upon their own historical factors. But however, try to understand what could be the disadvantage of this particular version of political system, where a unitary political system. Because the concentration of powers is only in the union executive. It is a union executive which may further delegate the power. I hope you understand the meaning of delegation. What do you mean by delegation? There is a difference between the word delegation and decentralization. While this is what is called as delegation, while this is what is called as decentralization. Wherever there is a federal political system, what they follow is decentralization. Wherever there is a unitary political system, they follow what is called as delegation. Now, delegation means all the authority is conferred only upon the union executive, and further the union executive, if they want, they can delegate the power to the subnational authorities, that is the further executives. So, the biggest problem with delegation is this is the authority which is delegating the power, and whatever authority they are delegating, they can take it back at any point of time at their own whims and fancies. Today they can give the power, tomorrow they can take up that particular power. They can strip them of all their powers, because ultimately the constitution is giving the power only to whom? Only to the union executive. For the purpose of ease of administration, they can delegate some power and which they can take it back at any point of time. But however, in case of India, the powers of the state executives are protected by whom? They're protected by the constitution. So therefore, the union executive cannot do anything about it. because it is a constitution that is guaranteeing their powers. Therefore, the Constituent Assembly, when they drafted the Constitution of India, they wanted India to be a federal political system, protect the interest of the states and the state executives. So, therefore, we have gone for what is called as a federal political system. Is that clear to all of you? So, similar to that of India, there are a lot of federal political systems, although different, the extent of division of powers can vary. So, for example, USA is a federal political system, Canada is a federal political system, but across the world, if you see, there are federal political system as well as what is called as unitary political system. Now, coming to the point of federal political system with unitary bias. So, what is the first thing that you have understood? We have understood that India is a federal political system, but now we are going to understand the exact version of federal political system. The kind of federal political system in India is federal political system with unitary bias. Now, what do you understand by this federal political system with unitary bias? Although there is division of powers, there is no doubt there is division of powers in the constitution, but there is no equal division of powers. There is division of powers, but who is given more powers under the constitution? The union is given more powers. The union legislature is given more power. The union executive is given more power vis-a-vis the state executive and the state legislature. So that is why, though there is a division of powers, more powers are concentrated in the hands of the union, both in case of legislature as well as the executives. That is basically what is called as federal political system with unitary bias. Can you just give me an example of where more powers are given? Although we will discuss that at the later stages, just to give a glimpse of an example. Why do we say more powers are given to the union executive and to the union legislature vis-a-vis the state executive and the state legislature? Okay, so the parliament has got what is called as a residuary powers. For someone who has got an idea, but a very simple example, anybody who can say, why do you think that the parliament is given more powers than the state legislature? How do you say this? One simple example could be, if the parliament makes a law, the application of that law can be throughout the territory of India. The law can be applied where? Throughout the territory of India. But if a state legislature makes a law, where the law can be applied? It can be applied only in the territory of that particular state. So therefore, who is having more powers with regard to the laws? It is the union, it is the parliament. I am just giving a very simple example. And apart from that, later we will understand the constitution. The parliament is given more number of subject matters where they can make the laws. And the subject matters on which a state legislature can make laws is very, very less. So while there is division of powers, but you will have to understand that more powers are concentrated in the hands of whom? Only in the hands of the union legislature, not in the hands of the state legislature. While there is division of powers, but it is not an equal division of powers. So this is with regard to the legislature. Now let us come with regard to the executives. With regard to the executives also, the union executive is more powerful than the state executives. Can you give me an example? How? That's the question. Give me an example. Very good. There is a provision of what is called as emergency powers. When the emergency is declared in our country, when there's a provision which is called as emergency, which I will subsequently discuss, but however try to understand, when any type of emergency is declared, then the states can be deprived of their powers. So the entire power will be taken up by the union executive. The state executive become a subordinate to the union executive when the emergency is declared. So these provisions are there, but never ever the union executive will become a subordinate to the state executive. Such provision is not there. During general time, they function as per the provisions in the constitution, but when the emergency provisions are used, what will happen to the state executive? The state executive become the subordinate to the union executive, but generally they are not subordinate. But during emergency, this may happen. So therefore, more powers are given to whom? More powers are given to the union executives. So what are the emergencies and all those things? Subsequently, I will discuss. But in general, try to understand there is a division of powers, which means the constitution guarantees a power to the union as well as the states, but there is no equal division of powers. Who is given more powers? It is a union who is given more powers. That is why it is also said, some of the political commentaries have said that it is a federation with unitary bias. It's a federation with centralizing tendency. So it is a quasi-federal in nature. It is not truly federal in nature, because in a truly federal political system, how it has to be? In a truly federal political system, there has to be equal division of powers. But however, under the Constitution of India, though there is division of powers, there is no equal division of powers. Okay, now can you think me why there is no equal division of powers? They could have given equal division of powers, but the members of the Constituent Assembly has chosen not to give equal division of powers. Rather, they have concentrated more powers in the hands of the union, both in case of legislative powers and also in case of executive powers. Why do you think so? Very good. It all, see, any country who has drafted their constitution has to look into the historical challenges that they have got. And one of the historical challenges when India was drafting its constitution is that there were a lot of forces where they want to secede from India. There were some princely states and some parts of the country they want to secede from our country. In order to bind the union as one single nation, they have given more powers to the union executive. They have given more powers to the union legislature. But however, in case of United States of America, their history was different. Their history was little different from how the Indian constitution came into force. So according to the historical factors, they have given for what is called as a federal political system where there is an equal division of powers. But in case of India, there was no equal division of powers. So the history and the challenges do influence as to what kind of constitution has been drafted. So just try to keep this in your mind. So is it clear to all of you as to what is separation of powers, what is division of powers, what is the last thing that you have seen, a federal political system with unitary bias? Is that also clear? Okay, so come to the next thing. What is the next point that you have to, what is mentioned? Integrated and independent judiciary. Okay, first let me explain the independent judiciary and then I'll go on to what is called as integrated judiciary. Now, what do you mean by independent judiciary? Independent judiciary, to put it in a very simple way, that the judiciary functions independently of the other two organs of the state. The judiciary is free from any unnecessary pressure from the other two organs of the state. What are the other two organs of the state? The legislature and the executive. Do you think that the legislature and the executive can pressurize the judiciary, especially the higher judiciary? When I talk of the higher judiciary, the high courts and the supreme courts in our country. Do you think that the judiciary in our country is really an independent judiciary? Are they free from the pressure of other two organs of the state? Can the executives pressurize the judiciary to give a judgment in their favor? Can the legislature pressurize the judiciary to give any judgment in their favor? No, they are largely an independent judiciary. And how do you think that the judiciary in our country is made an independent judiciary? I mean, what provisions in the constitution do you think that allows the judges to function independently without any fear from the executives? Not even the Prime Minister of India, not even the parliament or any of the authority in the parliament. So they don't have to fear about all those things when they pass the judgments. There has to be some protection in the constitution that really makes them independent. They cannot be removed except by a motion that is passed in the houses of the parliament. In fact, the word impeachment is not appropriate when it comes to the judges of the Supreme Court. I'll explain. The word impeachment under the constitution is used only for the removal of the president, not for any of the other authority. Although in the media and in certain other textbooks, they use the word impeachment for the judges also, but that is not a very appropriate thing. But yes, you might have read it somewhere. I don't disagree with that, but that's not an appropriate thing. Anyways, now you are right when you said that the judges can be removed by the process in the parliament. Now, do you think that that really makes the judges independent? That the removal process has been made extremely difficult under the constitution. Okay, let me ask one more question. In the history of last 75 years, after the constitution came into force, how many judges of the Supreme Court has been removed? How many judges of High Court has been removed? Any idea? How many judges of Supreme Court? How many judges of High Courts? Multiple prime ministers have been removed from their position by no confidence motion. Many IAS officers, many IPS officers has been removed from their service. Prime ministers, ministers has been removed from their service. But my question is, how many judges has been removed in our country after the commencement of the constitution, be it a judge of a Supreme Court or the High Courts? Not even a single judge of a Supreme Court and High Court has been removed till this point of time. Not even a single judge. Although there were actions that tried to remove some of the judges, but none of these process was successful till this point of time. That means though there is a provision to remove the judges of the Supreme Court, the removal process is not so easy. It is extremely difficult to remove the judges. Now, deliberately the Constituent Assembly has made the removal of the judges very difficult. Because why it has to be made very difficult? Because the judges, they know once they are appointed, it is very difficult to remove them. So therefore, they can function without any fear from any of the other two organs of the state. That makes the judges really independent. Very right. So whatever you said. So this is basically an example of how judiciary is independent. So independent judiciary means the judiciary should be without any fear. The judges have to function without any fear from the other two organs of the state. Do you think that it is making a sound rational to protect the constitution and to protect the rights of the people? The judges should be, or the judiciary should function in an independent manner, because ultimately who is supposed to protect the constitution? Who is supposed to protect the rights of the people when it is violated by the other two organs of the state? It is a judiciary, and for the judiciary to do all those things, do you think that the judiciary should be an independent judiciary? Yes. So some provisions are there in the constitution that makes the judiciary an independent judiciary. What are those provisions in detail, we'll subsequently understand, but right now try to understand the essence of independent judiciary, that the judiciary functions independent of the other two organs of the state. That is what is independent judiciary. Now what is integrated judiciary? We have understood what is independent judiciary. Integrated judiciary means that there is one single hierarchy of judiciary. That is basically what is called as integrated judiciary. And who is at the apex of this integrated system of judiciary? We have just one single hierarchy of judiciary. So try to understand this integrated judiciary. So at the bottom we have got what is called as subordinate judiciary. And above the subordinate judiciary we have high courts. So when I say subordinate judiciary, district courts and the courts below district courts, they are all considered to be subordinate judiciary, district courts and below. They are all subordinate judiciary. Then you have got what is called as high courts, and above the high courts you have got the Supreme Court. And this is one single hierarchy of judiciary. So this is what you will have to understand. This is one single hierarchy of judiciary. But whereas in case of legislature and in case of executives, what you have learned, there is a separate executive for the union, separate executive for the states. Legislature, separate executive for the union, separate legislature for the states. But there is no separate courts for the union and there is no separate courts for what is called as the states. There is only one single hierarchy of courts. Which means you should further understand, suppose let us assume a law is made by the parliament. Law is made by parliament. Let us assume this is one law, law number 1, which is a law made by the parliament. Let us assume law number 2, which is a law made by a state legislature. Let us try to understand these two laws. The law made by the parliament, now try to understand, can it be challenged in any high courts? Can it be challenged in a high court? Yes or no? Yes or no? A law made by the parliament, can it be challenged in the high court? Anybody from the state of Maharashtra? No one from the state of Maharashtra? Okay, no issues. Can a law made by the parliament challenge in the high courts? Yes, of course it can be challenged. Can a law made by the state legislature, can it be challenged in the Supreme Court? Yes, or it can be challenged only in that particular state high court. I am not asking where it can be initially challenged or something, but ultimately can it be challenged in the Supreme Court? That is my question. Can it be challenged? Yes, nothing prevents. That means you try to understand that there is an integrated system of judiciary. Whereas if it is not an integrated system of judiciary, there is also a certain system of judiciary in United States of America where they do not have an integrated system of judiciary, where there is a parallel judiciary. Every state will have their own high courts, or every state will have their own Supreme Court, and there is a Supreme Court for the entire country. And their parallel system of judiciary is something, if a law is made by a particular state, then that law can be challenged only in the state courts. And if the law is made by the union legislature, that law can be challenged only in the federal court, that is only in the Supreme Court at the national level. But that is not the case in India. In case of India, we have got what is called as an integrated judiciary. Be it a law made by the parliament or be it a law made by the state legislature, they can challenge it in the high courts. And if they are not happy with the judgment of the high court, they can make an appeal in the Supreme Court. So in this way, there is only one single integrated system of judiciary and there is no parallel system of judiciary. And this is basically what is called as an integrated system of judiciary or a hierarchy of judiciary. So in most of the cases where the first level of case will be entertained, where the petition will be entertained, in the subordinate judiciary. And if they are not happy with the judgment given by the subordinate judiciary, be it a law made by the parliament or state legislature, then the subsequent appeal will be made in the High Court. And if they are not happy with the judgment, then a subsequent appeal can be made in the Supreme Court of India. This is a general rule subject to certain exceptions. So this is basically what is called as an integrated system of judiciary, which means there is only one single hierarchy of judiciary. Is that clear? What is independent judiciary? Independent from the other two organs of the state. And what is integrated judiciary? We got one single hierarchy of judiciary. That means when it comes to judiciary, there is no division of powers. Where there is division of powers? Only in case of legislature and the executive. Is that clear? So these are all the basic understanding you should have. So what are the features that you have understood? These are all very, very important features, because without understanding the basic things, we cannot get into the Constitution of India. So what are the basic things that you have understood? So the first thing that you have understood is democracy. Can anyone quickly explain me as to what is your understanding of democracy? Ruled by people. Okay, just answer the questions. Okay. In India, we have a direct democracy or an indirect democracy? Indirect democracy, which is also called as the representative democracy. And within democracy, we also understood as to India has got what is called as parliamentary democracy. So what is the very essence of parliamentary democracy? Executive accountable to the legislature. And to whom the legislature is accountable? To the people of our country. And of course, in the separation of powers, they are also accountable to the judiciary through the judicial review. So this is the basic thing that you have to keep in your mind. Next, you have understood as to what is called as separation of powers. What do you understand by separation of powers in one single line? Horizontal distribution of powers. What is the very idea of separation of powers? What is the basic philosophy behind the separation of powers? Because separation of powers is not only in the Indian Constitution. It is there in the American Constitution, it is there in the French Constitution, it is there in most of the democratic constitution. What is the very philosophy of separation of powers? To prevent the concentration of powers in one single authority. But if you see the Indian Constitution, their primary focus is not on separation of powers, rather it is on the system of checks and balances. Now, how do you say that in India, though there is a principle of separation of powers, but the primary emphasis is more on what is called as checks and balances? It is because in India there is no strict separation of powers, but we have a clear system of what is called as checks and balances. Now, what do you understand by checks and balances? Can anyone just in one line, what do you understand by checks and balances? Very good. To checks and balances means it is a principle where one organ has some element of control over the other organ. That is basically what is called as checks and balances. Then we have understood what is called as division of powers. What is division of powers? Vertical division of powers between the organs. That is, to what extent the power is divided between the union executive and the state executive. To what extent the power is divided between the union legislature and the state legislature. But however, this division does not exist when it comes to the judiciary, because in case of judiciary, we have got what is called as an integrated judiciary. The next thing we have understood, though there is division of powers, that this division of power is not equal, but rather it is a federation with what is called as unitary bias. So what does it mean by federation with unitary bias? More powers are given to the union rather than to the states. But although whatever power is given, that is protected and guaranteed in the constitution itself. And then the last thing that you have understood is, in case of India, we have got both independent as well as integrated judiciary. So what is independent judiciary? That the judiciary is free from the control of the other organs of the state. That is unnecessary control. And then we have also seen integrated judiciary, that means we have got one single hierarchy of judiciary, where appeals can be made from the subordinate to the High Court and from the High Court to what is called as a Supreme Court of India. Is that clear to all of you? So these are all the basic features that you'll have to keep it in your mind before we proceed further. So come to the next concept. What is the next keyword in the syllabus, in the handout? Just give me a moment. Okay, written constitution. We already understood the concept of written constitution. Can anyone tell me what does it mean by written constitution? Okay, so what is the written constitution? A written constitution is something which is codified into a single document. The constitution is codified into a single document or multiple document. And also there exists a clear distinction between what is called as a constitutional law and an ordinary law. Then it becomes what is called as a written constitution. Now, who can tell me as to what is the difference between an ordinary law and a constitutional law? If that idea is clear, I think we can move forward. Can anyone volunteer and say what is the distinction between a constitutional law and an ordinary law? Okay, very good. So, these are all amount to what is called as a constitutional law. And what is an ordinary law? Parliament or the state legislature, and which is not part of the constitution. Very good. So, wherever there is a written constitution, there exists a clear distinction, but where there is no written constitution, this distinction does not exist. Example in case of written constitution is in India, and case of unwritten constitution is UK. The members of the Constituent Assembly chose India would continue to be a written constitution, but in case of UK, why they continue to be an unwritten constitution? Because they had a very long history. Because their constitutional history started way back in 1215 after signing of what is called as Magna Carta. But our constitutional history is much shorter, and we chose to be what is called as a written constitution. So, drawn from multiple sources, some basic idea here. What does it mean by one of the feature of the Indian constitution is that the constitution of India is also drawn from multiple sources. Now, what do you understand when I say it is drawn from multiple sources? There is also a saying that the constitution of India is a borrowed constitution. How many of you heard that the constitution of India is a borrowed constitution? What does it mean when I say that the constitution of India is a borrowed constitution? What has been done by the members of the Constituent Assembly when they are drafting the constitution? There are a number of democratic constitutions already, because India has got a very short constitutional history. So, when they were drafting the constitution, they have borrowed number of provisions, good provisions from various other constitutions. So, that is why Indian constitution is also called as a borrowed constitution, or it is also said that it has been drawn from multiple sources. In fact, who is the chairman of the drafting committee in the Constituent Assembly? Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. One criticism that the members of the Constituent Assembly pointed towards Dr. B.R. Ambedkar is that you are just borrowing the provisions from number of the constitutions. So, but Dr. B.R. Ambedkar accepted that gracefully. He said that while already number of constitutions are there where they have got good provisions and they are working well for the respective country, what is wrong in borrowing those provisions when India is drafting its constitution? You cannot leave out just because they are having those good provisions. So, therefore, a number of provisions has been borrowed, although we have made some minor changes which would accommodate the interest of our country. So, can you give me some examples of the borrowed constitution if you have an idea? So, here this is not very important that you know elaborately what are the other things. Few important things, if you remember, that is sufficient. Say for example, if you take the constitution of USA, we have borrowed some important provisions from the constitution of USA. Say for example, most importantly, the concept of fundamental rights has been taken from the Constitution of United States of America, where it is called as Bill of Rights. Okay, so the fundamental rights from the Constitution of USA. Anything else from the Constitution of USA? Okay, the American Constitution is the first written constitution to have a preamble. So we have taken the idea of preamble also, very good, from the Constitution of USA. Most importantly, the idea of judicial review. If at all you can compare the judiciary of India to any of the other countries of the world, it is similar to that of the American Constitution. So these are all important provisions that you have borrowed from USA. Of course, there are other provisions also, but these are all some of the important provisions. Now coming to United Kingdom. So what are the provisions that has been borrowed from UK? One important thing, parliamentary democracy. Very good. Parliamentary democracy, that is one important thing. Canada, federal system with unitary bias. I am just giving the most important thing. There can be a lot of other minor things also. Federal system with unitary bias. So what does it mean by federal system with unitary bias? That though there is division of powers, who is given more powers? The union is given more powers, both in terms of executive powers as well as legislative powers. Constitution of France, the idea of justice, liberty, so these major philosophies has been borrowed from the Constitution of France. Is there anything that you have borrowed from the Constitution of South Africa? The procedure to amend the constitution. Are you sure about this? That is fine. Let me check on this as to, because the procedure, I think we are following it from the constitution, because although they might have got the independent constitution after that, but even in case of South Africa also, they were also ruled by the Britishers. So might be possible that from whatever the law that they enacted, certain procedure was taken. But anyways, I'll verify this. Okay, that you brought it to my notice. Okay, then you have what is called as the Constitution of. These are all some major provisions. You have USA, UK, Canada, France, South Africa, Germany. Germany also we have got one important provision. Is there any idea as to what is the important provision? Suspension of fundamental rights during emergency. Not just per se the emergency provision itself, suspension of the fundamental rights during emergency. Then you have got Constitution of Ireland. From the Constitution of Ireland, any important provision? Very good. Directive principles of state policy, that is there in the Constitution of India. So, and then let me take the Constitution of USSR, which is no longer there, but erstwhile USSR. Have you borrowed anything? Fundamental duties. Very good. The fundamental duties from the Constitution of erstwhile USSR. So these are all some of the provisions that is still there in the Indian Constitution we have taken from the other countries. This is only, I'm just trying to give a basic idea, but number of other provisions has also been borrowed, but you don't have to remember this exhaustively, just remember few things. Okay. So that is basically because of these reasons, the Constitution of India is also considered to be what is called as a borrowed constitution, or a constitution that has been drawn from multiple sources. Alright, so come to the next topic, that is the Constitution of India. The other characteristics of Constitution of India is that it is both rigid as well as flexible. In the previous class, when we were discussing the difference between the written constitution and the unwritten constitution, I have given you one general principle. What is the general principle that I have given you? That written constitution is generally, the general rule that it is rigid in character, and the unwritten constitution is generally, it is flexible in character. Now, when I say that the written constitution is rigid in character, what does it mean? What does it imply? That it is very difficult to bring changes to the written constitution, because the procedure to amend the constitution is extremely difficult. But whereas when you talk of the unwritten constitution, the procedure is relatively easier, so you can make changes very easily. But India is an exception. The Indian constitution has both the characteristics. That is why I say that although most of the provisions has been borrowed, we have made few changes that would suit our requirement. If you see the Indian constitution is a mix of both. That it is a combination of both rigidity as well as flexibility. That what does it mean when I say it's a combination of both rigidity as well as flexibility? There are certain provisions in the constitution which is extremely difficult to amend, but there are certain provisions in the constitution which is easy to amend also. So both the procedures are given in the Constitution of India, but which provisions are easy to amend, which provisions are difficult to amend, that is not for you to understand at this stage, but try to understand that one of the feature in the Indian constitution is it follows a principle of both rigidity as well as flexibility. When I say rigid, some provisions are very difficult to amend. Right now, try to have that understanding, but not all the provisions are difficult to amend, because in certain case the procedure is relatively easy. In certain case, the procedure is relatively difficult. So both the provisions are there, which is a feature of the Indian constitution. That basically makes the Constitution of India, or one of the feature is both rigidity as well as flexibility. Alright, so these are all some of the important features you will have to keep in your mind. So now we are moving to the next thing, that is fundamental rights. Just only a primary introduction to the concept of fundamental rights. Okay, please tell me which part in the constitution deals with the fundamental rights? Part 3? Sure. Part 3 of the constitution. What is part 1 in the constitution? Union and its territories. Union and its territories. What is part 2 in the constitution? Now why I am asking this is, now UPSC has brought in a new concept. Now they are asking 1 or 2 questions from the parts, which has been largely ignored by the students. Earlier they used to ask questions from the schedules. Now UPSC also understand as to how the students are preparing. So the moment you understand that you are ignoring certain area, UPSC will ask questions from those areas. So I would suggest you in the handout that is given for today. Have you got the handout today? Which I will start after completing this. But if you see that all the parts are given there. So tomorrow when you come, I wanted you to memorize these parts. I am sure that in one day, if you remember also, you might forget, but try to look into it regularly so that you remember. Recently, I have seen few questions in the NDA examination. They have asked questions from the parts. Not one question, 3-4 questions from parts in one single paper. That means if you don't remember this, despite knowing everything in the constitution, you will miss out on all those things. So don't miss out, okay? So just remember that. Okay, so in the constitution, it is part 3. And we have taken this idea of fundamental rights from the American constitution. But before I get into fundamental rights, can you just tell me what is your understanding of the word rights? And then probably I'll go into the fundamental rights. What is your understanding of the word rights? Claims of citizens against the state. Very good. It is basically you are entitled for certain, I would say, privileges probably, or you are entitled to do certain things, and if when you are not able to exercise those things, you can make a claim against such things to the state. That's basically what is called as a right. But what is a rights is basically your claim when it is violated, that you can claim to exercise your right. But what is a fundamental right? Is there any other right apart from the fundamental rights? Now why the name fundamental right is there? So what are the other types of rights? Does it mean that there are other types of rights apart from fundamental rights? Now try to remember, whenever you use a word rights, generally that wherever there is a right, there is a remedy. Have you ever heard of this? Wherever there is a right, there is a remedy. What does it mean, wherever there is a right, there is a remedy? Very good. So when it means rights, basically means right also allows you to seek the remedy when it is violated. And where you can go for the remedy, you can go to the courts probably. But however, try to understand, wherever there is a right, there is a remedy. But the fundamental right is little different from the other types of rights. And that is why the fundamental rights are guaranteed in the constitution itself. Not the other types of rights mostly are guaranteed in the constitution. But the fundamental right is guaranteed in the part 3 of the constitution. That means fundamental right is little different from the other types of rights. Although other types of rights, when it is violated, can also be enforced in a court of law. But when it comes to fundamental rights, they are given the highest priority. So therefore, you should have an understanding of what fundamental rights in the first place. Fundamental right, unlike the other rights, is given the highest priority by the Constituent Assembly, and therefore they have given certain fundamental rights in the part 3 of the constitution. So therefore, if I ask a question, even before understanding what is a fundamental right, if I ask a question where these fundamental rights are there, fundamental rights are those rights which are placed in part 3 of the constitution. Only those rights are called as what is called as the fundamental rights. Can you tell me this part 3, what are the articles that they deal with? Yes, in the part 3 of the constitution, what are the articles they deal with? Fundamental rights are in part 3 of the constitution, and part 3 of the constitution is dealt from article 12 to what? Article 35. So why I am giving it, these are articles you will have to remember by heart. So at any time UPSC can ask questions. So these articles, as you do it regularly again and again, you will remember these articles anyways. Article 12 to Article 35. Now tell me what is a fundamental right. In the part 3, you have Article 12 to Article 35. So what is your definition of fundamental right? How would you define fundamental right?
Those like information in the part
That is not the definition of fundamental right. You are just locating where the fundamental right is. But that's a description probably. I am asking you to define as to what is a fundamental right. What can be considered to be fundamental right? No right can be taken away, in fact, not just the fundamental right.
those that can be violated by this.
Those
Can be violated by this.
those can be violated by the state. If it is to be violated by the state, why it is called as fundamental rights? In fact, not just try to understand this, not just the fundamental right. No right should be violated. Because that's why I said wherever there is a right, there is a remedy. In case of violation of any right, the remedy is allowed. So ideally, in an ideal state, no right should be violated. But we know that things are not ideal. So therefore, the violation might happen. So therefore, the remedy is also available. But in the part 3, just one more moment. But in the part 3 of the constitution, there's lot of rights that we as a citizen exercise. Say, for example, we have the right to vote. Say, for example, we have the right to property. Say, for example, we have a lot of other rights. Say, for example, as a consumer, you have consumer rights. Do you have consumer rights as a consumer? When you pay for any service, or when you pay for purchasing any product, or for that matter any service, if the service is substandard or if the product is of substandard quality, you can go to the consumer courts and file a case against them. So therefore, you may be given the remedy. But as a consumer, where you are exercising a consumer right, is it your fundamental right? Is it your fundamental right, or is it not your fundamental right? It is not your fundamental right. So therefore, wherever there is a right, there is a remedy. But the consumer, the right that you exercise as a consumer is not given in the part 3 of the constitution. But right to freedom of speech and expression is given, right to your freedom of profession is given, right against arbitrary detention is given, right to freedom of religion is given. That means right to education is given, right to life and liberty is given, right against discrimination on the grounds of religion, race, caste, sex, place of birth is given. So while certain rights are given, of course, certain rights are given in the part 3 of the constitution, but not all the rights. So therefore, what made the Constituent Assembly to list down certain rights and put them in part 3 of the constitution? That is my question. And if you try to look into that particular way, you will be able to define as to what is a fundamental right. Yes, please go ahead. It is your opinion only. Okay, just all right. So your opinion, these are all so essential and so basic. Okay, so these are from the okay, so as far as I can understand, she is of the opinion these are all very essential and minimal rights that would allow the individual to have a healthy development, and without these minimal or essential rights, they will not be in a position to realize the potential in their life. So minimal rights, that is very essential for a dignified human life or a dignified human survival. So can we put it in that particular way? Okay, so if you talk of natural rights has no legal sanctions, in fact. Now try to understand, natural rights is merely a philosophical concept. Natural right is something based on the philosophers, it is just that these are the rights that is conferred by the nature, or by virtue of being a human, they have to exercise certain rights. But they do not have any legal sanctions per se. And the natural rights are universal in character. So anywhere in the world somebody is born, so certain rights are conferred upon them, and just because they are natural rights, they cannot be enforced unless until that they are part of their constitution. But yes, the very genesis of the concept of all these fundamental rights or whatever it is, they had the genesis from the natural rights. In fact, few rights are considered to be so essential, and from there only the concept of fundamental rights has evolved over a period of time. But when you say fundamental rights per se, the idea of the Constituent Assembly as to why they put certain rights as a fundamental rights and place them in part 3 of the Constitution is that the members of the Constituent Assembly thought that without these minimal rights, for a human being, the dignified human survival is not possible, and they will not be able to achieve what they want to achieve in their life. So to that extent, certain minimal rights has to be given to them, and those minimal rights are placed in part 3 of the constitution. Just one more moment. But I said that not only the fundamental rights, any right when it is violated, they can have a remedy. So what difference is the Constituent Assembly making by placing these rights in the part 3 of the constitution? What is the distinction between those rights which is present in part 3 of the constitution and the consumer rights anyways we exercise, which is not there in part 3 of the constitution? Because in both the cases you can go to the courts. So the basic difference is by placing certain rights in part 3 of the constitution that empowers the affected citizen or the individual to directly approach the Supreme Court of India. So, but for your consumer rights, you have to go to the consumer court, and based on the judgment which is given by the consumer court, probably you can go for an appeal in the High Court, and then you can make an appeal in the Supreme Court of India. So for the other rights to get it enforced, you'll have to follow the ordinary hierarchy of courts. But whereas in case of violation of your fundamental right, where you can directly approach, you can directly approach the Supreme Court of India. So the only difference between fundamental right is the constitution is allowing for a speedy remedy for the affected individual, because the fundamental rights are considered to be so essential and so important for an individual's dignified human life. So therefore an immediate remedy should be given. So therefore we are allowed to approach the highest court in our country. And what is the highest court in our country? The Supreme Court of India. Not necessarily we will have to go to the Supreme Court, we can opt to go to the High Courts also directly. But if you want to go to the Supreme Court, we can go to the Supreme Court also. But that is not possible in case of the other types of rights. So if a question comes, what is your understanding of fundamental right? These are all very basic essential rights that allows an individual to have a dignified human life. And whatever is in the opinion of the Constituent Assembly such rights are, they place these rights in the part 3 of the constitution. And how many such themes of fundamental rights? I am asking themes of fundamental rights. I am not asking the different fundamental rights, different themes of fundamental rights which is there in part 3 of the constitution. How many themes? Today there are 6 themes of fundamental rights. Is it given in the handout? 6 themes of fundamental rights. If not, you can just make a note of it. So what are the different themes of fundamental right? One is right to equality. If it is not there, you can just make a note of it. Right to equality. Right to equality, article 14 to article 18. Right to freedom. So this class is not to explain these fundamental rights, just to give a basic idea about the fundamentals. Right to freedom. What is the articles for right to freedom? And this is also the for every theme and the relevant article also you should remember. So this was also asked in UPSC examination. Article 19 to article 22. Right against exploitation. Right against exploitation is article 23 and article 24. And then you have got right to freedom of religion. Right to freedom of religion or right to religion, that is from article 25 to article 28. And then you have cultural and educational rights of minorities. Article 29 and 30. Then of course you have the last thing is right to constitutional remedies. What is the article for right to constitutional remedies? Very good, article 32. These are the 6 themes of fundamental rights that is available presently, but in the original constitution there were 7 themes of fundamental rights. Do you know what was one more fundamental right, one more theme of fundamental right? Very good, right to property. This is in the original constitution, but this is not the case presently. In the original constitution, there was one more theme of fundamental right, that is right to property. Do you know what is the relevant article for right to property, the original constitution? Under which article this right to property was guaranteed? Article 31 and Article 19 clause 1 subclause F. So in fact, these two articles were guaranteeing what is called as right to property. Now, what is the status of right to property today? Are they still a fundamental right? It is. So today the right to property is no longer there in part 3 of the constitution, and this right to property was taken out of part 3 of the constitution by which amendment? Because to make any changes in the constitution, it requires a constitutional amendment. Can anyone tell me by which amendment this was taken out of part 3 of the constitution? 44th Constitutional Amendment Act 1978. By 44th Constitutional Amendment Act 1978, it was taken out. In fact, Article 31 was taken out. As such, whatever is mentioned in Article 31, the exact text was taken out and it is placed still in the Constitution but outside part 3 of the Constitution. Do you know where this Article 31 is placed today? It is placed under Article, very good, under Article 300A, very good, under Article 300A, not in DPSP, under Article 300A of the Constitution. So they created, insert a new article, Article 300A. So whatever is the text of Article 31, it was taken out of part 3 of the Constitution and they are given and inserted a new number, that is Article 300A. So therefore, right to property is still there in the Constitution. Yes, but not as a fundamental right. That is what is very important. That means we still do exercise what is called as right to property, but right to property is no longer what? No longer a fundamental right after the 44th Constitutional Amendment Act 1978. But what has happened to this Article 19 clause 1 subclause F? Article 19 clause 1 subclause F has been repealed from the Constitution. That means it has been removed from the Constitution. But whereas Article 31 is only removed from part 3, not completely, and it is replaced as Article 300A. So this has been repealed from the Constitution. Both the changes have happened by the 44th Constitutional Amendment Act in 1978. Both the changes are happened by the 44th Constitutional Amendment Act 1978. So is that clear to all of you? So therefore, how many themes of fundamental right we have today? 6 themes of fundamental right. In the original Constitution, there were 7 themes and removed by the 44th Constitutional Amendment Act. All these things can be asked in your prelims examination about the right to property. They can ask you what are the different themes, they can ask you about the article number. So what basically is a fundamental right? These are all considered to be the most important rights which would allow for a dignified human survival. In fact, the Constituent Assembly thought that there are 2 purposes for this fundamental rights. One is it promotes the individual. Does it promote the individual in any way? Does it help you in empowering yourself? And how do you think that it can empower yourself? Say for example, can you give me an example? Very good, you can express yourself. Right to freedom of speech and expression is there. So you can empower yourself, you can express your ideas, thoughts, you can write a book, you can carry out your own profession because right to freedom of profession is there. So these are all the way that you can empower yourself, you can promote yourself. But the objective of the fundamental right is not only promotive in nature but also protective in nature. Do you think that the fundamental rights also protect the individuals from any arbitrary action of the state? So can you give me an example of the fundamental rights that protects the individuals? Right against arbitrary detention, right to life and liberty. So these are all trying to protect the individuals from any arbitrary action of the state. So there are 2 major objectives of this fundamental right. One is it is promotive in nature and it is also protective in nature. And by keeping this in mind, they have listed down certain fundamental rights and they placed them in the part 3 of the Constitution. And by placing them in part 3 of the Constitution, in case if there is a violation of the rights, which is there in part 3 of the Constitution, the affected individual can directly approach what? They can directly approach the Supreme Court of India. So today, what is the status of right to property? If the right to property is violated, can we approach the Supreme Court of India directly? So what is the status of right to property today? Is it a fundamental right? It is still guaranteed in the Constitution. So therefore, it is still protected by the Constitution, or you can say it still continues to be a constitutional right. But however, try to understand that later you will understand that the right to property is also called as a legal right. But if I explain this right now, you will not understand. But right now, you try to understand that the right to property is still protected in the constitution, but it is no longer what? No longer a fundamental right. That means if right to property is violated, can you approach the Supreme Court of India directly? That is not possible. Only in case of violation of fundamental right, you can approach the Supreme Court of India directly. So in case of the right to property, you will have to follow the ordinary hierarchy of courts. But how right to property is also considered to be legal right, I will explain that further when I take up the part 3 of the constitution. When I go to fundamental right, I will explain first what is right to property, then I will explain all those things. Is that clear to all of you till this point of time? Okay. So come to the next topic. What is the next topic in the handout? Directive principles of state policy. So please write down the next topic, directive principles of state policy. Somebody wanted to ask me a question.
So there are different but why are they not classified in that case?
So later we will understand, because they does not give any right. Article 33 and Article 34 only talks about deprivation of fundamental rights. To what extent the rights can be deprived to certain categories of people. It does not directly empower anyone to do any fundamental. In fact, then you should ask about Article 12 and Article 13 also, because Article 12 and Article 13 also does not give any right. Article 12 defines what is definition of state. Article 13 talks about what is law. So similarly, Article 33 and Article 34 deals with to what extent the fundamental rights can be deprived to certain categories of people. And Article 35 talks about who can make law with regard to fundamental rights. So they did not directly confer any fundamental right, which we'll later understand as we'll proceed. Alright, so come to the next topic, that is the directive principles of state policy. So directive principles of state policy is in which part of the constitution? Very good, it is there in part 4 of the constitution. Can anyone tell me as to the articles in part 4 of the constitution? From which article to which article? So these are all something that you should remember. Very good. Article 36 to Article 51 in the constitution talks about the directive principles of state policy. You wanted to ask me some question? You were raising your hand. Do you have a question? No? Not now? Okay. Okay, so please come to the next topic, that is the directive principles of state policy, DPSP. Right, this is right from Article 36 to Article 51. So this is what is the directive principles of state policy. If you see the directive principles of state policy, what is the fundamental difference between the directive principles of state policy and the fundamental rights? Very good. Which is not legally enforceable? DPSP is not legally enforceable. But what about fundamental rights? Are they legally enforceable? Or in other words, fundamental rights are justiciable in nature, whereas the directive principles of state policy is not justiciable in nature. So which means, the other words is, one is legally enforceable and other is not legally enforceable, which means if the fundamental right is violated, can the affected individuals go to the court? Yes, that means it is justiciable in nature or it is legally enforceable. But what if some directive principles of state policy is not implemented? So can the citizens go to the court? But for which first we will have to understand as to what is directive principles of state policy. As the name suggests, directive principles of state policy means these are certain directives in the constitution. These are certain directives in the constitution. But the question is, to whom they are directives, whom they direct. So these are directives to the state. When I say these are directives to the state, there are directives to different organs in the state. So basically these are directives to the two organs of the state, that is the legislature and the executive. These are all certain directives to the state. Now the idea of placing this part, the directive principles of state policy in part 4 of the constitution is that when India became independent, it was still a very nascent, it is going to be a very nascent, a very new democracy. And then the government will have a lot of challenges as to what they are supposed to do, what they are not supposed to do. So therefore, the Constituent Assembly thought that for any new government that will be formed, they will give some directions as to what they should do. And if they follow all those things, if they implement all these directives, it will automatically lead to the welfare state, that it can lead to the welfare of the people. And to that extent, certain directives were placed in the part 4 of the Constitution. Can you give me some examples of directives that is there in the part 4 of the Constitution, if you can recollect certain directives? Uniform Civil Code is one of the liberal principles. Okay, yes, definitely it is a directive. But can you just think of some socialistic principles? Because that is what is the immediate attention. For example, equal pay for equal work. They wanted to provide equal pay for equal work. Minimum wages should be given. Distribution of material and wealth, distribution of material resources. So these are all certain directives that is placed in the part 4 of the Constitution. So the idea is that the Constituent Assembly, by placing these directives, they wanted the state to implement all those things, either by a way of a law or by way of certain policies. They wanted to implement all those things, and if these things are implemented, it will lead to the welfare of the people. But however, the Constituent Assembly thought that these things should not be justiciable in nature. That means it should not be legally enforceable. That means it is a direction to the state, but it is only a moral obligation on the part of the state. So what kind of obligation does it bring in? It only brings in a moral obligation. What do you mean by moral obligation and not a legal obligation? That means the state is not bound to do this. If the state wanted to do, they can do. But if the state is not doing it, then also the citizens cannot do anything. They cannot go to the court telling that the state is not implementing these directives. So the question is why it was placed as a moral obligation and not as a legal obligation. And in fact, there was a debate in the Constituent Assembly, and Dr. B.R. Ambedkar defended that it should be a moral obligation, not a legal obligation. Does anyone know what is the reason as to why it has been placed as a moral obligation? No, it is not just because it is not an appropriate time. They thought that the state is deprived of lot of resources to implement all those things, because these directives were so idealistic in nature that even a very developed country would need a lot of resources to implement all those things. And India being a very new democracy with lack of resources, they will not be able to implement all those things very quickly. And without resources, if you put all these directives and if you make it as a legal obligation, it is only going to increase the cases in the judiciary. So therefore, they thought that it would continue to be a moral obligation, and it is for the state to implement these things one by one as and when they possess the resource. So they have just left it as what is called as a moral obligation, not a legal obligation. But however, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar was convinced, even though it is only a moral obligation, the state cannot deny implementing these things for a long period of time. So what could be the rationale why Dr. B.R. Ambedkar thought that though it is a moral obligation, it puts a lot of pressure upon the government to implement all those things because of periodic elections. So he is of the opinion, if any government is ignoring and not implementing these directives, then they are answerable to the electorate at the time of the elections, and during the elections the people will remove this particular government. So therefore, though it is a moral obligation, there is a lot of pressure upon the government to implement these welfare policies. So therefore, he and the other members in the Constituent Assembly thought that it would continue to be what is called as a moral obligation, not a legal obligation. And in fact, Uniform Civil Code, which is subject to a lot of debate in our country today, is also a moral obligation. There is no legal obligation to implement and to bring in what is called as Uniform Civil Code. How many of you heard about this word Uniform Civil Code? Which is a very important topic, but I'll discuss that in detail when I take up the Directive Principles of State Policy. So the fundamental difference between the fundamental rights and the Directive Principles of State Policy, while the fundamental rights are legally enforceable and justiciable in nature, and what about the Directive Principles of State Policy? They are non-justiciable and they are not legally enforceable in nature. And in fact, what are the classification of the Directive Principles of State Policy? Socialistic, Gandhian and liberal intellectual principles. Is this classification given in the Constitution? Please think again and answer this question. Is this classification given in the Constitution? Yes or no? No? Anybody who thinks yes? In fact, this classification is not given in the Constitution. It is only based on their philosophy. It has been segregated for the academic purpose, but the Constituent Assembly or the Constitution does not segregate. So there are certain principles which are socialistic in nature. So broadly, how they are classified? The directive principles, they are classified into socialistic, to Gandhian and then liberal principles, liberal intellectual principles. Do you know why certain principles are considered to be socialistic in nature? These are principles which are majorly oriented towards equality, redistribution of wealth. So these are all principles which is towards the welfare of the worker, welfare of the poor. So these principles are majorly called as socialistic principles. And what about Gandhian principles? The principles which majorly reflect the philosophy of Gandhiji, who believed in rural economy, who believed in Panchayati Raj system, who believed in prevention of intoxicating drinks, who believed in uh, protecting cattle and other milch animals. So basically his ideas were given some kind of, his ideas were taken and that were placed in the constitution. So basically his philosophies and ideas were called as Gandhian principles. And what about liberal intellectual principles? These were principles not the immediate requirement, they were far ahead of the time, the kind of thought that they had. So for example, think way back in 1950, protecting environment and improving environment, that was far ahead of the requirement at that point of time. So they were considered to be very advanced as to what the state is supposed to do. So such type of principles, uniform civil code, far ahead of the time. Even today we are not able to bring in a uniform civil code. Think way back in 1950 about an uniform civil code. So these are all far ahead of the time, the thought that they had. So such principles were called as liberal and intellectual principles. Okay. So basically based on the principles they are classified, but such principles are not, such classification is not there in the constitution. But again, this is a very, very important area for the students, especially in your prelims examination. So during the course of discussion, I will discuss certain areas very important for the prelims. Please make a note of that. So please pay attention. UPSC can give you 4 directive principles of state policy and will ask you to identify which one of the above is a Gandhian principles. Or they can ask you to identify which one of the above is a socialistic principle or a liberal intellectual principle, which is, you can do it when I take up the directive principles of state policy, but this theme is very important for your examination. Okay. So what is the next thing? Free and compulsory education, that is no longer part of the directive principles of state. It's a fundamental right under Article 21A. You don't have to worry after the amendment. They are not going to ask you that before the amendment what was the status. So as far as the updated thing is what you should keep in your mind. Okay. So presently it is not part of the DPSP, it is a fundamental right and it is part of right to freedom, which is there in Article 21A. Okay, so what is the next topic? Okay, so from where you have taken the idea of this directive principles of state policy? From the Constitution of Ireland. Fundamental rights from which constitution? From the Constitution of United States of America. So write down the next thing. What is the next thing? That is fundamental duties. Okay, so please come to the fundamental duties. Online students, any doubt? If you have any doubts, you can put it in the chat box. I'll just look into it. So please come to the next thing, that is fundamental duties. Fundamental duties. So can you just tell me what is the fundamental duty, whatever you know, which part in the constitution? Part 4A in the constitution, which article in the constitution? Part 4A, and there's only one article that talks about the fundamental duties, that is Article 51A. Article 51A, and in fact this fundamental duty, we'll discuss what is this fundamental duty, but the fundamental duty was nowhere part of the original constitution. Can anyone tell me when this fundamental duty was inserted into the constitution? 42nd Constitutional Amendment Act in 1976. Students will always have a confusion between this 42nd and 44. But try to understand that right to property was repealed by the 44th Constitutional Amendment Act and the fundamental duty was inserted by the 42nd Constitutional Amendment Act in 1976. And who was the Prime Minister at this point of time? It was Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. What is the significance of 1976? This was an era of what? it was the era of, not the preamble, it was an era of emergency in our country. The second national emergency was there from 1971 to 1977 in fact. But this was an era of emergency time, and why I am talking about emergency is the emergency had some connection with the fundamental duties at that point of time. Anyways, 42nd Constitutional Amendment Act, the constitution was amended. They inserted a new part, that is part 4A, and they also inserted the fundamental duties. And do you know how many fundamental duties were inserted at that point of time? Originally, there were only 10 fundamental duties when the 42nd Constitutional Amendment Act was brought in. At the time, there were 10 fundamental duties, and presently, how many fundamental duties? So, presently, there are 11 duties. And can anyone tell me when the 11th duty was inserted? That is about the duty of the guardian or the parent to educate the child. That's the 11th fundamental duty that was inserted. Which amendment? It was by the 86th Constitutional Amendment Act in 2002. So, sometimes all these factual information can also be asked. Okay, now coming to the question of what is a fundamental duty and what is a similarity between the fundamental duty and the directive principles of state policy. Is there any similarity between the directive principles of state policy? Both are moral obligations. Very good. So, in case of directive principles of state policy also it is a moral obligation. In case of fundamental duty also it is a moral obligation. But what is the major difference? Very good. While the directive principles of state policy is a moral obligation upon the state, while the fundamental duty is a moral obligation upon the citizen. It is for the citizens to perform these duties towards the state. Whereas the directive principles of state policy, it is for the state to perform those actions or directives, implement those directives for the welfare of the people. It is the obligation of the citizens to perform these duties towards the state. Can you just recollect some of the duties, if you can recollect what is there in part 4A of the Constitution? Very good. Respect the national anthem, national flag. To protect the monuments and places of importance, okay. Protecting the environment. Any other duty that you can recollect? To have scientific temper, and so on and so forth. Some duties are there. Now, why I am asking this particular question is, in one of my interview, the UPSC, in the interview they have asked me this particular question. So, I am very happy that they have asked this particular question, because after preparing for 3-4 years, when you go to the interview, when they ask you what is a fundamental duty, it is not a very difficult question. But think that UPSC board is not going to ask you a very easy question. So, in fact, I was also under the impression that they are asking me a very easy question. So, the first question that they asked is, what is a fundamental duty? Do you know what is a fundamental duty? I said, yes sir, I know. Okay, tell me some of the fundamental duties. I said some of the fundamental duties. The third question that they asked is, tell me some of the fundamental duties that you have not performed. So, it is very difficult for you to say that you have not performed some of the fundamental duty. But you can also not say that I have performed all the duty, then it appears that you are telling a lie. So, therefore, it is a very difficult question to answer. The question appears so easy, but it is not so easy question. So, just assume yourself you are sitting in front of an interview board, and if the board is asking this particular question, how would you answer this particular question? Tell me some of the fundamental duties you have not performed. And the moment if you say that, there can be a follow-up question, why you have not performed such duty? It is a duty of every citizen to perform that particular duty. So, they can ask you, are you not a good citizen who is not performing the duties? So, how can we expect you to become a good civil servant if you are not even performing a duty as a citizen? So, you will have to think all these things in your mind while you answer such question, so that there is no follow-up question that would put you in a difficult situation. So, just take this exercise and see how would you answer that particular question. So, later I will tell that what kind of answer that I have given. I think I have done decently well. I scored 200 marks in the interview out of 275. So, I have done a very decent performance in tackling this particular question. But I wanted you to think, because I do not want to just give the answer for this particular question. Okay. Okay, so where we are with regard to the fundamental duties. Okay, so the fundamental duties were inserted by the 42nd Constitutional Amendment Act 1976. So, the fundamental difference between a fundamental duty and the directive principles of state policy is, while the directive principles of state policy is a moral obligation for the state, whereas a fundamental duty is a moral obligation for whom? for the citizens. But in both the cases, it is only a moral obligation. So if you remember this, that's more than sufficient. Later, remaining things I'll discuss when I take up the fundamental duties as we'll enter into the constitution. What is the next topic? Secular state. Okay, write down the next topic, that is secular state. Secular state. Do you think India is a secular state? How many of you agree that India is a secular state? Okay, so there should be any doubt in that. India is definitely a secular state. Now, what do you understand by a secular state? There are many constitutions across the world which call themselves to be a secular state. So, what is common when you talk of a secular state? Separation of religion from not the politics, religion from the state. So, politics is different, state is different. Any political party can do politics, but they are not state. So, therefore, separation of state from what is called as religion. Okay, now when you talk of a secular state, primarily you have to understand the most important thing when you talk of a secular state is the state does not identify itself with any particular religion, or the state will not have an official religion. Do you think that India has an official religion? Do you have an official language? We do not have an official language. Official language, I am talking about official language. Do you have an official language? Do you have a national language? Just think about it. Do you have a national language? Yes or no? Do you have an official language? Yes. Now try to understand, we do not have a national language. We only have what is called as an official language for the official communication and official purpose. But when you talk of a secular state, it is very, very important that the state does not have an official religion. The state does not identify itself with any religion. Rather, any secular state for that particular matter, the state respects all the religion equally. So when you talk of a secular state, it is not that the state is against the religion. The only thing is the state does not identify itself with any religion, and the state respects all the religion equally. That is the basic essence of what is called as secularism. This is true for all the countries who follow secularism, but however there is certain element of difference when it comes to secularism that is followed in Western countries and the secularism that is followed in India, which I will discuss in detail when I take up the preamble topic, but I wanted to give a basic essence of this. So the first thing that you have to understand is what, when I talk of secularism, the state does not identify itself with any religion. The state is non-religious in character. It does not own any particular religion, or it does not support any particular religion, or it does not discriminate between any religion. So this is general for all the countries, but however, the kind of secularism that we follow in India is little different from the secularism that is followed in the Western countries. Do you know what is the main difference between the secularism that is followed in India and the secularism that is followed in the Western countries? There is a complete separation between the state and the religion when it comes to the concept of secularism, or in other words, it is what is called as negative secularism. The state is completely divorced from religion. In India also, the state does not have any official religion, but the question is India as a state, is it completely divorced from religion? In India, it is not completely divorced from religion, or the state is not completely divorced, or there is no complete separation between state and religion. That means the state can involve in certain religious matters, which is not allowed in the Western countries. In the Western countries, strictly the state should not involve in any religious matters. Religion is completely a private matter. Religion is completely within the sphere of an individual. The state has nothing to do with that. But do you think it is same in case of India? Now, for example, recently there was a festival which is called as Kumbh Mela festival. Do you think in that there was a state involvement with regard to that? Was the state involved in that? Was the state providing some aid, financial aid in doing all those things, protection and all those things? But that thing cannot happen in the Western countries. There is complete separation of what is called as state and religion. Let me put another example. Say for example, do you think in India the state can give some donations to construct temples and all those things? Temples or be it mosque, has it happened in India? Is it possible? Or let me put it, so there was something which is called as, for the Muslim, there was something which is called as Hajj pilgrimage. And for the Hajj, which has been discontinued recently, but few years earlier, for the Hajj pilgrimage, the government was giving some subsidy, people who wanted to go for Hajj pilgrimage. Do you think that is possible in the Western countries? That is not possible in the Western countries because religion is purely a personal matter. But although in case of India, try to understand, in case of India, that the state does not own any particular religion. The state does not identify itself with any religion, but there is no complete separation between state and religion. Whereas in case of the Western countries, there is complete separation between state and religion. That is why the kind of secularism that is followed in the Western countries is what is called as negative secularism. The state does not interfere in the matters of religion. But whereas in case of India, there is no complete separation, and the kind of secularism that is followed in India is also called as positive secularism. Now, why it is called as positive secularism? Because the state can positively make interventions in the matters of religion. So, can you just think of more examples where the state can positively make interventions? In fact, you'll have to understand the history as to why different kind of secularism is followed in different countries. It is because of the historical reasons. They also have tailor-made secularism. But one thing that is common in both the cases is the state does not have any official religion. The state does not discriminate on the basis of religion. But the difference in terms of secularism as to what is followed in Western countries and India, in Western countries they are negative, that means complete separation, but in India there is no complete separation. Because when the Constituent Assembly was drafting the constitution and subsequently when the constitution is to be implemented, the members of the Constituent Assembly thought, the founding fathers, complete separation is dangerous for our country. Now, why do you think complete separation may not work out in India? The complete separation may not work out in India because there is a lot of inter-religious problem, intra-religious problem. In fact, inter-religious discrimination, intra-religious discrimination were there in our country. What do you mean by inter-religious discrimination? Between different religions, the minorities were oppressed by the majorities. That issue was there in our country. And it is not only the inter-religious problem, but intra-religious also, because within the religion also upper caste was dominating the lower caste. In the name of religion, there was a lot of practices which would amount to violate the rights of the people. Say for example, untouchability was recognized as a practice within the Hindu religion. They accepted this as a religious practice. Child marriage was accepted as a religious practice within the religion. So therefore, in the name of religion, if the state is completely diverse from the religious affairs and practices, they thought that that would amount to violating the rights of the people. So therefore, the state cannot be mute spectator to the religious practices. And hence the state wanted to make interventions in the religious practices wherever it would amount to violation of the rights of the people. So therefore, the Constituent Assembly members thought that we cannot be a mute spectator and allow the religion, the people to take care of the religious affairs, but wherever it is important, we'll have to make an intervention positively. And therefore, the kind of secularism that we follow today is what is called as positive secularism. And whereas in the Western countries, they follow majorly what is called as negative secularism. But in both the cases, what is the similarity? The similarity is that the state does not identify itself with any religion, nor they discriminate on the basis of religion. But the difference is where there is a clear separation, but whereas in case of India, the state makes an intervention. That's basically what is called as the positive secularism. Can you just think of some examples where the state has made interventions in the matters of religion in the recent past? Very good. The state has brought in a law where it is trying to strike down what is called as instant triple talaq, not all forms of triple talaq. I think there are multiple forms of triple talaq within the Muslim personal laws. But one practice that has been made illegal among the practice of triple talaq is instant triple talaq. Does anyone know what is this instant triple talaq? Even I'm not knowing much about the personal laws, but based on the newspaper reports and all those things, what is this instant triple talaq? Instant triple talaq is a practice that the husband can say talaq, talaq, talaq 3 times, and the moment the husband says talaq the 3rd time, the divorce has been done between the husband and the wife. And some newspaper report I also found that sometimes the husband can do the SMS also, talaq 1st time, 2nd time talaq, 3rd time talaq. Or a telephonic conversation also they can say talaq. So 3rd time talaq means, of course, the 1st time talaq means warning, high level of warning 2nd time, and then the 3rd time the divorce is done. So this was not approved by the law. So the law has struck down these things, which is basically a religious matter and a religious affair. But positively the state has made an intervention. This is not only with regard to the Muslim personal laws, but in any law they can make an intervention. Recently now the government is trying to amend the Hindu Marriage Act also. They are trying to prevent what is called as the marriageable age of women. Do you know what is the marriageable age of women presently? 18 years, which they have wanted to bring it uniform to 21 years across all the religion. So that is also a positive intervention that they are trying to make. They are amending all the religious laws. A bill has been introduced. Whether it will become a law or not, that's a different thing. So the state can make positive intervention, because what is the marriage age of men? Article, what is the marriageable age of men? 21, and for women 18. So there was a petition that is seeking that amounts to what is called as principle of equality. So therefore, to bring in equality between the gender across religions, so they are now trying to increase the age of women also to 21 years. Anyways, so I'm just trying as to how the state can make interventions in the matters of religion. So that is why we call in India that it is positive secularism, whereas in case of the Western countries, it is negative secularism. Negative in the sense that they completely separate themselves. But whereas in India, the state can intervene in the matters of religion positively to bring in positive change. That is positive secularism. This is the essence of positive and negative secularism, but there are more to discuss, which I'll do when I take up the preamble topic. Okay. Is that clear to all of you what is secularism? Secularism primarily means what? Primarily that the state does not identify itself with any religion, it does not have any official religion, nor it discriminate people on the basis of religion. But in India, the state makes positive intervention in order to protect the rights of the people, even if it amounts to religious practices. That is why we say it is positive secularism. Alright, so what is the next topic? It can also be seen as an intervention, because Waqf is a matter which is related to managing the religious properties by a religious, in fact by the Muslim religious community. So it's a, whether it is a positive intervention or not, it is for the court to decide, but prima facie it appears to be an intervention by the state. Okay. Okay, what is the next topic? Universal adult suffrage or universal adult franchise. Both the things are same. Suffrage or franchise means rights basically. Universal adult suffrage or universal adult franchise, which basically means universally to all the adults the right is given. And what is the right that is given? It is right to vote. Now presently what is the age for voting? It is 18 years of age. That means any adult individual who has attained 18 years of age will have the right to vote by default. And if somebody has attained 18 years of age, is it possible for the Election Commission of India not to allow them to vote? So in other words, although the constitution guarantees the universal adult suffrage, my question is that on attaining 18 years of age, everybody should be given the right to vote, or they have to meet certain other requirements also apart from attaining 18 years of age. How many of you think that no, the only requirement is attaining 18 years of age? How many of you think there can be other requirements also? What are the other requirements, do you think? How many of you have voted in the elections? Any elections, Lok Sabha, Legislative Assembly? That means you have met all those requirements. So what shall be the other requirements? No. Yes, if you are in prison, then your right may be suspended. Yes, if you are convicted in a court of law, then your right is suspended. If you are unsound mind, your right may be suspended. Very good. Of course, you should be a citizen. If you are not a citizen, then your right is suspended. Very good. You should be a citizen of India. You should be a resident of that particular constituency. That is very important. If you are not a resident in that particular constituency, then your right will be suspended. So you should be a resident of that particular area. You should not be of unsound mind, and you should not be debarred from any of the law in our country. If any law is made by the parliament that prevents you from voting, then in such particular case also your right to vote is not given. Subject to all these conditions, then if you have attained 18 years of age, you shall have the right to vote. So it is not that just only 18 years of age. You should meet all these requirements. But the moment you fulfill all these requirements, when you have attained 18 years of age, then there shall be no discrimination on the grounds of religion, race, caste, whatever be it. Everybody shall have the right to vote. But for time being, you can understand that what is universal adult suffrage? Every adult individual shall have the right to vote, subject to the law that is made by the parliament. I'll discuss the other eligibility criteria when I take up the Representation of Peoples Act. The Representation of People Act provides for the other criteria, which I'll later discuss. But presently, what is the age to vote? assuming that you satisfy all the other criteria, 18 years of age. But in the original constitution, it was not 18 years of age. What was there in the original constitution? It was 21 years. And when this 21 years was reduced to 18 years? Very good. It was by the 61st Constitutional Amendment Act. So this 21 years has been reduced to 18 years by the 61st Constitutional Amendment Act. So just try to remember the amendment. Sometimes they can ask it in the prelims examination. Alright, so what is the next topic? Single citizenship. Single citizenship. So what does it mean by single citizenship? That there is only one citizenship for the citizens, irrespective of wherever they reside, irrespective of they belong to whichever state they are. There is only one citizenship and only one identity, that is citizenship of being an Indian. In fact, there was a debate in the Constituent Assembly that similar to that of the American Constitution, dual citizenship should be given to the Indians also. In America, how many of you know that there is dual citizenship? That is citizenship for the entire country and citizenship for every state. But however, the Constituent Assembly did not agree with this idea of dual citizenship when it comes to India. Do you know why they did not agree the dual citizenship? Because primarily they thought that it would be against the idea of fraternity, against the idea of the common brotherhood. And if they give multiple identities, they thought that which would prevail over the national identity, the regional identity would prevail over the national identity. So they did not agree with this particular idea, and they thought that there will be only one single identity of being an Indian. And of course, yes, whatever you said is also right, because the moment you start giving the regional identity, even today you can see some element of the disputes. You can always see some dispute that is happening, that people who are coming as migrant laborers working in certain other states, there is strong opposition to the people from Bihar coming and working in Bombay, in Maharashtra, and similarly in certain other parts also these can continue. So this would be more if multiple identities are given. So in order to avoid all those things, the Constituent Assembly thought only one identity, that is only a national identity, that is only a single citizenship. But how do you think that the same is working out for United States of America, two citizenship? Will they not have that particular problem? Very good. As I already said, that every constitution depends upon their history. Without the dual citizenship, their constitution would not have come into force in the first place, because unlike the Indian Federation, which is a holding together federation, the American Federation is a coming together federation. Now try to understand, if you see the history of United States of America, they never existed as one single country. Multiple small nations, they came together and they formed one federation to be stronger in the future. So therefore, when the states came together, it was a condition that based on which their constitution was formed, that each and every state should also be given a citizenship. So therefore, based on their historical factors and all those things, their federation has formed. But in case of India, it is little different. Okay, so today we have got what is called as single citizenship. What is the next thing? Is it possible for any citizens to have multiple citizenship? I mean, can they take up a citizenship of some other country? Is it possible? Yes, they can take up the citizenship. If they take up the citizenship, then the Indian citizenship will be terminated. So if they are okay with that, then they can take up the citizenship. But at the same time, they cannot have the citizenship of another country. Okay, what is the next topic? What is? Very good. Independent bodies. So write down. This is something that we will discuss. Independent bodies. Independent bodies. Now, what do you understand by independent bodies? Before I go to the independent bodies, we have seen three important organs in the state. So what are the three important organs in the state? Legislature, executive and judiciary. We have also discussed this as a part of separation of powers. Now what is the idea of having three independent bodies? Sorry, what is the idea of having three important organs? What is the idea of the separation of powers? To prevent the concentration of powers. But these are the three major organs in the state. But apart from the three major organs of the state, we have certain other independent authorities also. That means that is apart from these three organs, we have certain other authorities, and these authorities are independent of these things. They cannot be controlled by these organs also. So such bodies are what is called as independent bodies, which neither comes under the executive, nor under the judiciary, nor under the legislature. So can you give me some examples of such independent bodies under the constitution? So let me give these independent bodies under the constitution. For example, one important body is the Election Commission of India, which is under Article 324 of the Constitution. Other is the Office of the Comptroller and Auditor General, CAG, under Article 148 of the Constitution. Other is the Finance Commission of India, under Article 280 of the Constitution. And then if you want more, other is the Union Public Service Commission and the State Public Service Commission, under Article 315 of the Constitution. And then if you want the National Commission for Scheduled Caste, National Commission for Scheduled Tribes, and the National Commission for Backward Classes, which is respectively under Article 338, Article 338A, and Article 338B. So these are all called as independent bodies, and they are also called as constitutional bodies, to name a few. So these are all some examples of very important independent bodies under the constitution, and they are also called as constitutional bodies. Now why they are called as constitutional bodies? They are not mentioned just in the constitution. So if you use the word they are mentioned in the constitution, then that is wrong. So for example, the word political parties are mentioned in the constitution. If you read the 10th schedule of the constitution, it talks about the word political parties. Does it mean the political parties are constitutional, have a constitutional status? So not everything that is mentioned in the constitution is a constitutional body, but they are all established by a specific article in the constitution. So then they would become what is called as a constitutional bodies. And most importantly, they are all independent bodies. When I say independent bodies, means what? They are independent of the organs in the state. That means they are not completely independent, but largely they function independently. Largely the Election Commission of India will carry out the elections independently. Largely the Comptroller and Auditor General, what does a Comptroller and Auditor General do? They audit the expenditure and the revenue of the government, which is their function, which they do independently primarily. What is the role of the Finance Commission? The Finance Commission will give certain recommendations related to finances to the government, which they function independently. So whatever is their function under the constitution, they does that independently. Now similarly, what is the function of Union Public Service Commission, the State Public Service Commission? They are majorly the recruiting agency. So UPSC is a recruiting agency for the union government, and the State Public Service Commission is a recruiting agency for the state, where they largely carry out the recruitment process independent of the executives or the other organs of the state. And then what about the National Commission for Scheduled Caste, Scheduled Tribe, and the National Commission for Backward Classes? They are all respective commissions to protect the rights of the people. That is, National Commission for Scheduled Caste would protect the rights of the scheduled caste people in our country. National Commission for Scheduled Tribe would protect the rights of the scheduled tribe population. And the National Commission for Backward Classes is supposed to protect the right of the backward community in our country. And largely they function independent of the other organs of the state, which doesn't mean absolute independence, it's only relative independence. So relatively they are independent of the other organs of the state with regard to the functions that is entrusted upon them by the Constitution of India. So these bodies, apart from the three organs of the state. So these are all some independent bodies also. Excuse me, this is the classroom, okay? So try to maintain certain amount of what I would say that is not distracting me when I'm doing the classes, okay? Okay, so this is how you'll have to understand as to what these independent bodies are. So have you understood the concept of independent bodies? So independent bodies, they are supposed to perform certain functions. Okay, so these are all some independent bodies that you'll have to keep in your own. What is the next topic? Emergency provisions. So come to the next topic, that is emergency provisions. emergency provisions. What do you understand by the emergency provisions? In fact, if you see emergency provisions, I think it is there in part 15 of the constitution. I just want to verify this, but I think it is part, it is part 15. Can you just see in the handout what is the part? Part 18, huh? Is it part 18? Okay, part 18 in the constitution. So part 18 in the constitution, which talks about the emergency provisions, this contains from article 352 to article 360. This is what the emergency provisions. Does anyone know what are the emergency provisions? The different types of emergencies allowed under the constitution. But before I go to that, do you know what does emergency means? What is the emergency? Can anyone give me what is your understanding of emergency? When the state of normal affairs is disturbed. So whatever is the normal situation is disturbed in our country, and then therefore there can be use of emergency provision. Emergency is only an extraordinary situation. That's not a normal situation. So during normal situation, the country is supposed to function in a particular way, but the same thing cannot function or the same thing cannot continue or sustain when there's an emergency situation. So what can be seen as an emergency situation? For example, suppose India is at war with Pakistan, and now there is a lot of reports after the Pahalgam terror attack that some response might be there from both the countries, which may lead to the war. And in case if there is a war, there is a possibility that the government can declare what is called as national emergency. That's a possibility because war is not a normal situation. So when there is an emergency situation, the constitution can also go for a transformation. The constitution completely transforms itself. During normal time, it functions in one way, and during emergency situation, the constitution can go for a transformation. But again, it depends upon the type of emergency. So for which you will have to understand as to what are the emergencies that is allowed under the constitution. There are three types of emergencies that is allowed under the constitution of India. One is the national emergency. One is the national emergency. Other is the state emergency, or which is also called as, what is the other name for the state emergency? Which is also called as a president rule. And then the third thing is what is called as the financial emergency. So you have got what is called as the national emergency, the state emergency, or the president rule, or the third thing is what is called as the financial emergency. And just to remember the relevant articles right now. So the national emergency can be imposed under article 352. The state emergency or the president rule can be imposed under article 356. And the financial emergency has been imposed under article 360. Among these three types of emergency, which type of emergency has been invoked number of times, the highest number of times? State emergency, or is it national emergency? How many of you think it is state emergency? How many times do you think that the state emergency has been imposed? Multiple times. Any number, rough approximate number? As per the 10 times, who said? Okay, 10 times. Any other number that you can propose? 15, 30? As per the newspaper reports, it has been imposed more than 140 times in our country. The 10 that you are talking about, only in the state of Uttar Pradesh, it has been imposed more than 10 times. So therefore, one emergency that has been invoked number of times is the state emergency. In fact, later we will understand these emergency provisions. There is a lot of criticism to this emergency provision. Now why? What did I say? During the emergency provision, the constitution goes for a transformation. So normally what kind of constitution is the Indian constitution? Normally it is a very good, normally it is a federal political system. And what does it mean by federal political system? That there is not equal powers, there is division of powers. There is division of powers between the center and the state. But do you know what will happen when there is an emergency provision? The constitution becomes unitary in character. Rather than a federal political system, one important change that will happen is the constitution automatically transform itself from a federal political system to a unitary political system. When I say the constitution transforms itself from a federal political system to a unitary political system, that means the powers will be concentrated in one authority. Which authority it will be concentrated? It will be concentrated in the union executive, in the union legislature. The states will be deprived of their powers because it's an emergency situation. So therefore, yes, that is permissible under the constitution itself. So that is why there is a lot of criticism when this provision was drafted in the Constituent Assembly, that tomorrow if the emergency power is used, what will happen to the states vis-a-vis the position of the union center? The state becomes subordinate. Otherwise, they are not subordinate. Otherwise, they directly derive the powers from the constitution. But during emergency, they are sent to a subordinate position. So therefore, some of the members in the Constituent Assembly voice this particular concern. What if this emergency power is tomorrow misused? Because who under the constitution has a power to declare emergency? The president has the power, and who does so on the aid and advice of the prime minister and the council of ministers. So therefore, what if this power is abused in the future? So some of the members did raise their concern, but ultimately majority members accepted. So therefore, today we have got the emergency provision, and that is why Dr. B.R. Ambedkar said, especially with regard to the state emergency, because it has been invoked number of times, more than 140 times in the independent history of India. There are only 2 states in our country where the state emergency has not been imposed. Can you just guess what are the states where the state emergency has not been imposed? In the state of Tamil Nadu, it has been done more than 8-9 times. So state of Tamil Nadu is one state where they have imposed more times, because state of Tamil Nadu is one state which gives a lot of voice to the principle of what is called as federalism. So therefore, the center sometimes is not happy, whoever is voicing concern with regard to the idea of federalism and strong center-state relationship. So state of Tamil Nadu 8 to 9 times has been, the president rule has been imposed, or the state emergency has been imposed. So just think of the new states. Of course, it should have a very recent history. State of Telangana, yes, there is one state where the president rule has not been imposed. The government earlier tried, but they could not do that. So any other example apart from the state of Telangana? Very good. Again, the state of what is called as Jharkhand, or it should be, it is not Jharkhand, it is Chhattisgarh, which is the recently created state. So these are the 2 states where the president rule has not been imposed, but otherwise in all the states it has been imposed. But anyways, coming back to the emergency, now try to understand that there are 3 emergencies, but especially with regard to the state emergency, there is a lot of criticism. And in fact, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar said, though this state emergency provision is there, he envisaged this state emergency or the provisions under Article 356 in the Constitution remains a dead letter in the Constitution. He himself wanted what? This provision remains a dead letter in the Constitution. That means, although he was an advocate who supported this idea of state emergency, but he wished this remains a dead letter in the Constitution. That is why the political analysts today criticize what he envisaged to be a dead letter has become a deadly weapon. That where various governments has used this provision again and again, the union government, and has placed various states under the president rule. Anyways, I will discuss this in detail at the later stages. But what is the basic understanding you should have? The first type of emergency is national emergency. National emergency means this can be imposed throughout the territory of India. For the entire territory of India, they can impose what is called as national emergency. But not national emergency should be imposed only throughout the territory of India. It can be in part of India also. But if they want, if the president wants, he can invoke the national emergency throughout the territory of India. Alright. So this is with regard to the national emergency. And how many times do you think the national emergency has been imposed? Very good. It has been invoked 3 times in our constitutional history. Can you just recollect the years when they have invoked? Very good. 1962 after the Chinese aggression. 71 second time, and then when is the third time? 19, very good, 1975 was the third time. So 3 times a national emergency has been invoked in our country. So this can be done throughout the territory of India. So in the 3 emergencies, it has been done throughout the territory of India. And then state emergency. Now the basic difference between national emergency and state emergency is, well, the national emergency can be throughout the territory of India. State emergency is always for a particular state, and it will be for the entire state, not for the other states. Wherever the state emergency is invoked, it can be in that particular state. That is what is state emergency. And when a state emergency is invoked in that particular state, then who will take up the administration of that particular state? it will be taken up by the president, not the governor. That is why it is called as a president rule. On behalf of the president, the governor may exercise, but it is generally to be exercised by whom under the constitution? It is a president. But if the president wants, the president can delegate the power. That is a different thing. But the power directly comes to the president when the state is kept under the president rule. So this can be for the entire territory of India. This is only for that particular state. And then financial emergency can be throughout the territory of India. And how many times a financial emergency has been invoked in our country? Not even once. So this is something we do not have a precedent with regard to what is called as financial emergency. While the national emergency, just listen to me one more moment. Well, the national emergency is usually declared when there is an emergency situation like war or external aggression in our country, or in case of armed rebellion within the country also. So these are all the grounds on which it can be imposed: war, external aggression, and armed rebellion. What do you understand by war? You understand that war is a full-fledged official declaration of aggression by both the countries. What is external aggression? External aggression is also a ground on which the national emergency can be imposed. External aggression means where there is an unilateral aggression. War means it is on both the sides. And external aggression is a unilateral aggression where India has not yet responded to that. But that's also an emergency situation. War, external aggression. And then the third thing is what is called as armed rebellion. What do you mean by an armed rebellion? Well, war and external aggression are considered to be external reasons, where armed rebellion is considered to be an internal reason. What is an armed rebellion? Can you give me an example of armed rebellion? Very good. Tomorrow if the Naxals on a large scale take up arms and fight against the government, where the government feels that it is so dangerous, then it can be considered to be an armed rebellion. Although we have not gone for any emergency on the grounds of armed rebellion till this point of time, because the state is so mighty that within the country somebody taking up arms and fighting against the government is not an easy thing. But yes, that is also ground on which the emergency can be declared. And then you come to the state emergency. Do you know what is the ground on which the state emergency or the president rule can be imposed? When there is a constitutional breakdown in that particular state. Now, what do you understand by constitutional breakdown? What is constitutional breakdown is not defined in the constitution. But what can be seen as a constitutional breakdown? So, for example, if any state government, that particular state government loses majority in the state legislature. Because I said that when in a parliamentary democracy, any government is formed, that government needs to have the majority in the Lok Sabha at the union level. Similarly, in the state level also, whenever any government is formed, that government needs to have majority where? They need to have the majority in the legislative assembly of that particular state. And if they lose the majority in that particular state, then that can be seen as a constitutional breakdown. So therefore, the state will be placed under what? The president rule. And then what is the ground? I'll give a table finally. So what is the ground on which a financial emergency can be imposed? When the financial stability and the credit of India is threatened. And again, what is financial stability and the credit of India is threatened is not defined in the constitution. But what is generally seen as a financial stability and the credit? So for example, if the bank is not, if RBI is not having sufficient foreign exchange reserve. So any country should have foreign exchange reserve sufficient minimum up to 90 days. Now, why do you need foreign exchange reserve? Why? That will give stability to our country. Because for all the imports that we are doing, we'll have to pay it in foreign exchange reserves. We cannot pay it in rupees. We'll have to pay it in the international currencies. And if you do not have that reserves, then your entire import is going to stop, and which is required, which is important for the country to function normally. Because it is not in all the cases you are self-sufficient. In fact, even in 1990s, India was completely dependent on energy based on the oil that they have imported. And for the oils, we'll have to pay it in what is called as a foreign exchange reserve. So then your financial stability is threatened because of this. And if the government debt is so high, for example, you know that the government has an expenditure, the government has a revenue also. If the government revenue is so less, but the expenditure is so high, then the government is not sustainable. So the financial stability of the government is threatened. Under such a situation, the president can proclaim what is called as the financial emergency. But fortunately for our country, we have not faced a situation of what is called as financial emergency. But although the government was on the verge of declaring financial emergency at one point of time, but they have not done it. Do you know when it has happened? It was in 1990, 1991. That was the time the government was almost on the verge of going for a financial emergency. And fortunately, the government of India has got loan from the International Monetary Fund. India's foreign exchange reserves was only 15 days of reserve. In another 15 days, India will not have any foreign exchange reserve. That means India will not be able to import oil. That means India's energy security is completely going to collapse. That is a time that the International Monetary Fund has given a conditional aid. And you also know that if you have studied economics as your background, that is also the time when India started what is called as liberalization, privatization, and globalization. And that, in fact, that problem has turned out to be a boon to India, and that is when India started developing rapidly after the LPG reforms. And who was the finance minister of India at that point of time? It was Dr. Manmohan Singh, who was the brain behind the liberalization, privatization, and globalization. All right, anyways, but we do not have a precedent for what is called as a financial emergency. You can just make a note of this particular table, very important. You can just make a note of this particular table, and in the future you can just recollect this. But later I'll discuss about all these emergencies in detail. It is only just to give a brief idea about the emergencies. Put type of emergencies. It is there in the handout. Can you just see it? All right. So then it is not required. Okay, just remember the grounds on which the emergency can be declared. So what is the ground on which the emergency can be declared in case of the national emergency? War, external aggression, and armed rebellion. And what is the ground on which it can be declared in case of the state emergency? Constitutional breakdown, or the exact word that is given in the constitution is the state government is not able to carry out the governance in accordance with the provisions of the constitution. But in short, you can call that as a constitutional breakdown. And in case of the financial emergency, it is the financial stability or the credit of India is threatened. Okay, and the relevant article is 352, 356, and Article 360 in the Constitution. Just remember this. Sometimes they can ask you, but what is even more important is what are the consequences when these emergencies are imposed, and what is the broader consequence that I said? That the Constitution goes for a transformation. And what is the direction of transformation? The direction of transformation is that the federal political system becomes unitary in character. And once they become federal to unitary in character, there are a lot of other consequences which will deal with in detail when I take up the emergency provisions. I'll do that when I take up the executive part, which is a very big topic. One entire class will talk about the emergency. So at the time I'll discuss about these things. All right. So with that, we are almost done with certain important features. Do you have any of the other topics? So almost everything is done. So before I proceed to the next topic, I wanted you to revise all those things. So very quickly, shall I ask you some questions based on whatever you have observed till this point of time? Okay, so what is the difference between separation of powers and checks and balances? Okay. So separation of powers is only assigning different roles and responsibilities, but checks and balances is about how one organ is able to exercise some element of control over the other organ. So do you agree with the view that though the Constitution of India provides for separation of powers, but we rely mostly on the system of checks and balances rather than separation of powers? Do you agree with this viewpoint? Can you give me as to why do you agree with this particular viewpoint? Any one of you? Now, first of all, why do you say that there is no clear separation of powers? Because when you answer a particular question, why some students get more marks when they write the answer is that they try to address each and every part of the question. So even though you write excellently well in one area, but you fail to answer a particular part, then the evaluator will not be able to give you the best marks. The first part is that you should say that why there is no clear separation of powers. Then you can explain about how the emphasis is more on checks and balances. Because there is no clear separation of powers, because there is an overlap between the legislature and the executive. So there is no clear separation of powers. Therefore, the emphasis is more on what? The system of checks and balances. There you explain what is checks and balances, and you also give examples as to how one organ is having control over the other organ. All right. So these things are very, very important. So try to revise all those things. What is the next handout? Okay, so there are certain keywords that we'll have to discuss. So let me just take 5 more minutes to get you through the keywords. The first and foremost keyword that I wanted you to explain is what is article. What are the 3 keywords which is mentioned? What is article, parts, and what is a schedule? So how many of you heard about all those things in the constitution? What is an article, what is a part, and what is a schedule? So the first thing is, what is an article, what is a part, what is a schedule? Does anyone know how many articles are there in the Constitution of India? 395 was there in the original constitution. That was there in the original constitution. After that, 106 amendments have happened to the Constitution of India. So does anyone know presently how many articles are there? 448 is not the right answer. So it is way more than 448 articles. So if possible, you try to do this exercise and try to find out the number of articles presently after all the 106 amendments are notified. Let me see who is able to give the right answer with regard to the number of articles. But anyways, what is an article? Okay, how many parts are there? At least the parts and schedules are not an easy, not a difficult thing. So this is there in the original constitution. Do not repeat this again. So none of these things are true presently. So in the original constitution, the number of articles 395. This is in case of the original constitution. When I say original constitution, what is the original constitution? The constitution that came into force on 26 January 1950, as it read on 26 January 1950. And the first constitutional amendment act was carried out in 1951. And from 1951, the constitution has gone for a change. Before that, this is the case. There were 395 articles. How many parts? 22 parts. Very good. How many schedules? Very good. There were 8 schedules. But none of these things are true today. All the things have gone for a change. Okay, articles I wanted you to find out. Let me see who is giving the answer. Otherwise, I'll give the answer tomorrow. How many parts are there? Today, there are 25 parts. And how many schedules are there? 12 schedules are there. But before we understand them, as we will proceed, we will have to understand only all those things. But for me, today, I wanted you to understand what is an article. What is an article? How do you define an article? Before that, how did you define a constitution? It is a collection of rule books, or it is a not collection of rule books, it's a collection of rules, or it is a collection of fundamental rules. So all the rules combinedly is what is called as a constitution. So how do you can define an article? Each and every article is a single rule in that particular book. In the rule book, each and every article is a rule which deals with a specific matter. That's basically what is called as a article. So how do you put it in a very simple way? An article? An article is nothing but a specific rule in the constitution. That is basically what is called as an article. Then how do you define a part? A part is nothing but collection of rules which is related to a specific matter. So for example, if you take part 3 of the constitution, what is part 3 of the constitution? Part 3 of the constitution talks about fundamental rights. Part 3 of the constitution talks about fundamental rights. But within part 3 of the constitution, there are number of articles, and every article is talking about a specific fundamental right. So what is an article? An article is a specific rule, but what is a part? A part is a collection of rules which is related to one another. Because all the articles in part 3 of the constitution, are they in one way or the other related to fundamental rights? They are all related to the fundamental rights. So what is part? Part is nothing but collection of rules related to a specific matter. That is basically what is called as a part. Now take the example of part 2. What is part 2 of the constitution? Citizenship. In citizenship, if you see, there are articles from article 5 to article 11. While every article deals with a specific matter related to citizenship, but combinedly they are all related to what? They are all related to citizenship. Same is the case with part 4 of the constitution, DPSP. Each and every article is related to certain directives, but collectively they are all related to what? To the directive principles of state policy. So what is an article? An article is a specific rule. And what is a part? A part is a collection of rules related to a specific matter or related to a common theme, or you can say it is related to a common matter or common theme. Now, what do you understand by a schedule? Schedules are nothing but like an appendix to a textbook, like an appendix or a table. So normally you put these appendix or table in the back of the textbook. So similarly here in the Constitution of India, normally you wanted to give some extra information which is already dealt in the article, but if you put all those information in the article itself, it will not look so organized. In order to make them organized, you put those extra information which is related to a specific article, which is related to a specific rule, but these informations are placed in a specific schedule. So that is basically what is called as a schedule. To put it in a very simple way, they are like appendix or tables, but they are placed separately in the Constitution, but they are following from a particular article. So what is the source of the schedules in the Constitution? A specific article. Say for example, Schedule 1 in the Constitution. Does anyone know what is Schedule 1 in the Constitution talks about? List of states and the union territories. It lists the names of the states and the union territories and also the territories of these states and union territories. But what is the source of Schedule 1? It is Article 1. Article 1 says India, that is Bharat, shall be union of states. Article 1 further says that Article 1 shall have the names of the states and the union territories. So instead of placing the names of the states and union territories in Article 1, they are placing this in a separate schedule. So therefore it looks so organized. So schedules are nothing but they are like tables or appendix, but they are sourced from a specific rule which is given in the Constitution. So is it clear? So whenever I use the word article, whenever I use the word part, whenever I use the word schedule, you should not have any confusion. An article is nothing but a specific rule. But what is a part? A part is a collection of rules related to a common theme. What is a schedule? A schedule is nothing but like a table or an appendix which is sourced from a specific article or which provides extra information related to a particular article. But the schedules are placed separately. They are not placed along with the articles. Have you ever gone through the Constitution? Have you ever gone through a Bare Act where you will understand as to how these things are placed? If possible, you can go through it. It is not that the Schedule 1 is placed along with Article 1 itself. Schedules are placed in the end of the Constitution. After all the articles are over, then starts what is called as the schedules. Schedule 1 to Schedule 12 of the Constitution. And does anyone know when the 9th schedule was inserted? Just a factual information if you know. Because the original Constitution had how many schedules? 8 schedules. Then subsequently 4 schedules are added. The 9th, 10th, 11th and 12th. Does anyone know when these schedules were inserted? Any idea? When was the 9th schedule was inserted? 1951 by the first Constitutional Amendment Act. Just you can make a note of this because all these things can be asked in the prelims examination. It doesn't mean that I will not deal with all those things at the later stages. Again, I will deal, but I am just giving a basic factual information. First Constitutional Amendment Act 1951. When was the 10th schedule inserted? Is the information given? It is all given, no? Okay, it is given there. So, anyways, it is better that you hear once so that it is also easy for you to remember. 10th Constitutional Amendment Act was inserted by the 52nd Constitutional Amendment Act 1985. 52nd Constitutional Amendment Act 1985. The 11th and the 12th, they were inserted by the 73rd and the 74th Constitutional Amendment Act in 1992. So sometimes this itself can be asked in the prelims examination. So with that, we are almost coming to the end of the class. So what is the next topic that is given? I am not going to discuss, just wanted to know. Judicial review. I will explain that a little further, but I already discussed the concept of judicial review. Can anyone recollect the concept of judicial review? So basically, it is a power of the judiciary to review the actions of the other two organs of the state. So power of the judiciary to review the actions of the other two organs of the state. What are the other two organs of the state? The legislature and executive. And to what extent they can review? To what extent the judiciary can review the actions of other two organs of the state? No, to the extent that whether whatever they have done is a violation of the Constitution or not. So if they are in violation of the Constitution, then to that extent they can be declared to be unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. So this is basically the power of judicial review. So remaining things we will discuss it in the next class. So but before we wind up, very quickly, what are the things we have covered? So the first topic we have covered is separation of powers. Separation of powers is more horizontal in nature, and we also distinguish between what is separation of powers and what is checks and balances. I wanted you to practice that particular question today, tomorrow, whenever you want to write it, you can show it to me, and then I'll also give you individually as to how you can structure the question better. Okay. The second thing that you have discussed is division of powers. What do you mean by division of powers? It is more vertical in nature between the different levels of government and different levels of legislature. And who is guaranteeing the powers to the executives and the legislature different levels? The constitution itself. And that is why it is called as a federal political system, or there is a division of powers. But when it comes to judiciary, we have learned that the judiciary, there is no division of power, there is an integrated and an independent judiciary. Independent judiciary means the judiciary is independent of the other organs largely. Integrated means there is a single hierarchy of judiciary. And then we have also learned, though this is a federation with what is called as unitary bias. That means though there is division of powers, the division of power is not equal in nature. Who is given more powers? The union executive and the union legislature is given more powers, because that is how the history has influenced when the constitution was drafted. What is the next point that you have seen very quickly? Written constitution, you know. What is the next thing? Okay, what is the basic distinction between a written and an unwritten constitution? There is a distinction clearly between what is a constitutional law and an ordinary law that does not exist in an unwritten constitution. Next thing, rigid and flexible. So the Indian constitution has a unique feature of both being rigid as well as flexible. That basically depends upon the procedure as to how the constitution can be amended. That later we will discuss. But right now, remember, it is a combination of both rigidity as well as flexibility. Fundamental rights. How many themes of fundamental rights there were in the original constitution? Original constitution 7. Presently, what is the position of right to property today? Remember, it is a constitutional right, it is also a legal right. Okay, but why it is a legal right, I'll explain that later. But for time being, I have given an explanation of why it is a constitutional right. Directive principles of state policy. What is the fundamental difference between DPSP and fundamental rights? One is the direction to the state, and other is the right that is given to the citizens. But most importantly, one is justiciable, other is non-justiciable. And then fundamental duties. What is the similarity between fundamental duties and DPSP? Both are non-justiciable in nature. But what is the difference between both the things? Very good. One is for the state and other is for the citizens. What is the next thing? Secular state. What is the difference between the kind of secularism in India and Western secularism? Where we follow what is positive secularism, positive intervention is allowed, while they follow what is negative secularism. Next thing, universal adult suffrage. What is the voting age presently? In the original constitution, 21. Which amendment has made this change? 61st Constitutional Amendment Act. Next thing, single citizenship, you know. Next then, independent bodies. Independent bodies means largely they function independent of the other organs, and they have very specific function to perform, guaranteed and protected by the constitution itself. Next thing, emergency provisions. What are the different types of emergencies we have got? National emergency, state emergency, and the financial emergency. Which emergency has not been invoked till this point of time? Financial emergency. Which emergency has been invoked most of the times? State emergency. And the national emergency has been invoked 3 times. But the most important thing is the consequences of these national emergencies. For every emergency, there is a specific consequence. But in general, one thing that is common for all the emergencies is that the federal political system becomes unitary in character. The extent of unitary character varies depending upon the emergencies, but in general, it goes for a transformation. All right. So just take 2 minutes. Any questions you have got, please raise your questions, and then we can take a break. No, I said that they cannot be controlled by the other organs, not 2 organs, by the other organs. Then I said that doesn't mean absolute independence. I only said it is relatively. Say for example, today if the Election Commission of India is doing something arbitrarily, then the petitions can be filed in the Supreme Court and the court can look into this. But generally the courts will not interfere with the functioning of the Election Commission of India, because some element of freedom has been given to them to carry out the elections in a free and fair manner. Yes, the appointments are largely done by the government, but for certain areas there is a system as to how these appointments has to be done. So, for example, recently with regard to the Election Commission of India also, there was a change that the Supreme Court of India has brought in, that there should be a select committee based on which the appointments has to done, broadly to prevent that the government does not appoint their own people or their own loyalists to the Election Commission of India. So, yes, although it is some element of faith has been entrusted, but largely they are all considered to be what is called as independent bodies. No doubt. Any questions from the online students? Okay, so for the online students, if you want to send the answer, you can send the answer. You can note down my number. You can send the answers to my WhatsApp. So normally you can send it to my WhatsApp. I do not check the other things. You can send it to my WhatsApp. Offline students also, if you want to ask some questions, you can ask it. Okay. But do not send the answers and immediately put the reminder, question mark and all those things. So give me some time, I will respond to those things. Okay. So as a students, you should have some patience also, because there are multiple students who might ask the teacher. So normally 1 or 2 days you can wait, and then after that you can send me a reminder in case if you are not getting any reply. But I would prefer the offline students come and show it to me directly, so therefore I can give the comments and all those things. It will always better to have a direct interaction if you are part of the offline class. But online students who are not part of the offline thing, so they can send it to me. Okay. But the offline students, you can also send your doubts. If you have any doubts, you can send it across. Suppose you are reading something, suddenly once you have some doubt, you can just send across a message to me. That is not an issue. All right, any other questions? No questions? Okay, tomorrow first 5 minutes I'll take up the questions. Okay, so then I'll move to the next part, and please do revise on a daily basis. If you revise it on a daily basis, it is going to be easier. All right, so thank you very much. We'll meet tomorrow.